All right, looks like we are live. Good to see everybody. Good to see so many cool people in the chat tonight. It's late night on SFT, Redefine Living. You are right, brother. Thanks to Logical, Plausible, Probable for sending everybody over. We promise you this stream will be one to remember. We've got a ton of great stuff for you, ton of great content, information, and material, including videos and clips that we've put together. Matt Man should be here momentarily, and therefore I thought I would go over some reminders pertaining to some upcoming events. So again, thanks for being here, everybody. Doki Doki SFT fan club. Thank you so much, brother, for the super sticker and the support. Couple other super stickers. Doki Doki, I appreciate it. You guys are the life and blood of this channel, so God bless you. We appreciate the support. You guys are amazing supporters, are the reason why we're able to do this full time. So again, thanks, John, for sending over everybody for this show. So a couple reminders for everybody. Tomorrow, we're going to be back here for another epic debate. So make sure you set your reminder, because we're going to be having another must-watch debate on the Trinity. Does the Bible teach the doctrine of the Trinity? Matt Slick versus Taylor Stewart. Both seasoned debaters, both Matt and Taylor have debated this topic numerous times. So it's definitely going to be a memorable showdown. I'm pumped. We also had a similar debate about a week ago. Matt Slick versus Dr. Shabir Ali. That debate's getting a ton of great feedback, tons of content and commentaries around YouTube and the internet pertaining to this debate. So if you have not yet seen it, please do check it out. We've also just scheduled a couple exciting debates. This one I am especially looking forward to. Jackson Rowe and Dr. Kent Hovind debating the important question, is there evidence for human evolution? I've debated Jackson in the past. Nephilim Free has as well. And now Jackson is going to be taking on Dr. Dino himself. So that's going to be on the 28th, sometime next week, I believe next Thursday. So set your reminders for that one. The last Dr. Dino debate we had just last week, we almost set a record. We had like 360 to 370 people. That debate's getting a ton of good feedback. I think it's over 6,000 views right now. That was, if you have not seen that debate, definitely check it out. One of my personal favorite debates, especially on the topic of cosmology. Then in a few weeks' time, November 5th, the big round 3 endgame. Snake was right and Dr. Dino debating the Genesis flood, fact or fiction. The last time Snake was here, he debated Joseph Hubbard, which was a must-watch debate as well. They debated the topic of young earth creation and Noah's flood. So to kind of prep yourself for this epic showdown, check that out if you have not yet seen it. Couple shout outs in the chat. Doki Doki. Yeah. We decided to put on Jackson Rowe's mean face just to kind of pump everybody up, because it's going to be a battle. So no, he's definitely a nice guy. He's respectful. He brings some good arguments, some good up-to-date arguments. So that's going to be a ton of fun. And you know what? I'm going to share screen here because we do have some other lectures as we wait for Matt to join us. I want to let everybody know, I want to remind everybody about these upcoming lectures because I've already got questions coming in. Okay, you can either email me, leave a question over Facebook. You can leave a question in the comment section, because these upcoming presentations, we are going to be having a lecture, but then we're going to be having an extensive Q&A for every single one of them. So because we have the experts here, this is not only the Young Earth creationists, our fellow Young Earth creationists, opportunity to ask questions, but the critics. If the critics got objections, if they have questions, send them in. We've got some great questions already for Mike Ord this Thursday. So this is the critics' chances. I mean, if they got some arguments and objections, this is your chance to ask the expert. So we're going to be having the Green River Formation with Mike Ord Thursday. Next week, we got a huge week, 25th, 26th, 27th, and 28th, all epic shows. Joseph Hubbard, Sal Jardina. Sal's going to be giving an epic presentation. I had a meeting with him. He's got a new studio, new computer. He's ready to go. I got a sneak preview of his lecture, and it is going to be epic. And of course, Steph Harima is going to be here on the 27th, giving a presentation / rebuttal to Dr. Kevin Hankey, who made a video response, I think roughly a month ago, to our last video that we did with Steph Harima. So that being said, guys, actually what just came to mind, Doki Doki, thank you so much, brother. Doki Doki left a comment here. So before I forget, memberships are available. So if you want to become a member, we got the cool tiers, I believe. If I'm not mistaken, we got the pre-flood or the antediluvian world. We've got the post-flood world, new heavens and new earth. So check those out. Lots of cool stuff. I'm excited about these memberships. And if you want to keep us going full-time and help us out with full-time daily content, help us out setting up these interviews, helping us out with the website and other kind of behind-the-scenes stuff, including new books that we're currently working on, please consider supporting us. So we appreciate all your help. And that being said, I think it is now time to call for our man with the plan, Matt Man.
The bad phone signal.
What's up?
There he is, Matt Man himself. What's going on, man? I know you've been busy fighting crime, so I figured you might have been duking it up with the Joker tonight. So I thought I'd give you a few extra minutes. I'll go through some reminders and kind of announcements. So
yep, you know, once that sun goes down. Yeah, once that sun goes down, people start acting up.
That's right. You're fighting crime by day, and you're debunking evolution by night. So it's no time for sleep.
Yeah. No, none.
Good thing you're all raw and organic, because that kind of counterbalances the no sleep, right, brother?
Yeah, exactly. Allows me to run around and train like a maniac, not get tired.
So we got a great chat. It's late night on SFT. I know we've been doing later streams, but it really helps us actually get things done all during the day and also prepare for these shows at night. So as everyone can tell in the audience, we've been doing a lot of late shows, but they've been getting good feedback. So I think we're going to continue doing this because we have so many topics to deal with, so many response videos we want to get to. If you have not yet seen, I believe it was either last night or the night before, starting to forget, I did a stream where I focused about 80% of it on testable predictions pertaining to the deep time model of ancestry and the young earth creation model of ancestry. So I put out numerous challenges and questions and arguments in that video. and there's been no response, no rebuttals, no counters, just a lot of dodging. So as I always say, it's 2021. It's a great time to be a young earth creationist. So if you get the chance, definitely check out that show. Yes, tons of great debates. I'm working on a few others, actually. Those are the ones I just got a chance at getting the thumbnails and setting. I just confirmed today another big debate for the very first week of January. Dr. Shabir Ali back debating Chris Date on the question, does the New Testament teach that Jesus is God? So that's going to be an awesome debate as well. Anyways, enough for announcements and reminders. You guys came here to see us debunk PBS. This is going to be a ton of fun. Matt, did you want to kind of introduce the topic for tonight? Let the audience know what we're going to be doing and what they can expect.
Yeah, I was given this video a couple days ago to check out, and it was a very interesting video because as you are listening to the narrator, he's describing the process of the out of Africa theory. But in doing so, he is confirming that evolutionists use their preconceived notion that evolution is true in the video and doesn't even realize what he's saying. Now I realize he's not a scientist and he's probably reading from a teleprompter, but the fact that he directly states that they alter the ages of mutation rates is probably what we want to show people the most. There's a lot in the video that we're going to take apart, but the mere fact that they state directly in the video, you're going to see, they admit that they changed the phylogenetic or the mutation rate to a phylogenetic mutation rate because the observable rate doesn't match what we see. And so therefore it doesn't match evolution. So they have to change the dates. And so the person brings up mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, and he says the exact same words for both of them. And you guys won't be able, you might not have caught it because it's real fast, but we'll make sure that you guys catch it.
Yes, we will. And that's what we've got ready for you guys is a couple of clips where we're kind of just going to throw it in your face because a few days ago, I had a conversation with a skeptic, and to the arguments supporting the biblical model of ancestry, this particular skeptic, after I pointed out how many assumptions, and how much calibration goes into their model and into their dates, he pointed out that, well, I'm going to have to look into that. Young earth creationists are liars, so I can't believe anything they say, right? This is what the critics try and point out. So tonight we are going to show you irrefutably and undeniably that the secularists or the deep time proponents, the ones that are knowledgeable on the topic of ancestry, they freely admit that they calibrate the data with assumed deep time history, with an assumption that common ancestry happened. They assume archaeology, geology, so on and so forth, guys. So we are going to demonstrate this is a fact irrefutably. And also, this is why they don't match up to the young earth creation model of ancestry with their own predictions. Matt, as you know, they are not meeting the gold standard of science. And we've pointed out in the past that to answer this question of ancestry, okay, we must look at the direct lines of evidence. And that's why we love genetics, right, Matt? That's why genetics is so important, because it's the direct way. It's the empirical way to answer this question of ancestry. That's why the very first book I ever wrote, The Biblical Model of Origins Made Easy, right? The question of ancestry finally answered. I focused a lot on genetics because it's genes, it's traits, it's genetics that are inherited, sperm and egg, not a bone, not a rock, not geology, not geography, all these indirect lines of evidence that the critics want to look to. No, it's genetics.
Right, which is,
yeah, go ahead, brother.
Which is quite funny too, because when you ask them, Kent often does and say, "What's your best proof for evolution?" They go, "Well, the fossil record." And then when from debating these people, when they say, "Well, what's your favorite line?" You can say, "Well, abiogenesis." They say that has nothing to do with evolution. And yet they're so quick to jump on something that also isn't evolution, because when you use the fossil record, they say, no, it's only a change of allele frequency. It's only genetics. So when we come out with genetics, that's the funniest part about it at all. They want to change the subject and take it back to that weak inference-based methods, what we like to call low confidence science. The ones where you can story tell the most.
Great points. Great points. It's low confidence science, low quality science that they want to look to answer these important questions. We want to look to high quality and high confidence science. And we've made videos in the past, funny videos where, these evolutionists, including professors, they will at first say, well, we have the evidence for common ancestry because we have the fossils, we have the bones found in the dirt. Then we'll point out, or specifically in a debate, Kent Hovind has pointed out that no, fossils are indirect lines of evidence. The fossil record is where you can do the most storytelling. It's low confidence, low quality. And then all of a sudden it comes back to the evolutionists. And what do they say? Well, we don't need the fossil record. It's not about the fossil record, right? So at first it's the fossil record. Then you point out how fallacious and weak that is. And then it's, well, we don't need the fossil record because we got X, Y, and Z. So it is funny. And it's a little sad at the same time. So
It is. It's sad because without their fossil record, which they invented, by the way, they don't have the ability to even create this molecular clock that you're going to see they invented to match. Without it, they would only be left with the observable evidence, which tells us mankind lived recently. So it's the assumption leading it's starting with a conclusion, believing that it's true, using the assumption, and then trying to prove that assumption true. And when it doesn't hold up, changing the data to fit it. That's evolution. That's what it's become. Anti-science.
Amen. Amen. And one thing I want to point out too is the evidence that points to the young Earth creation model of ancestry. It's a double whammy, because it not only refutes naturalistic evolution and theistic evolution, but it actually refutes old Earth creation. Because for the most part, I understand there are exceptions, but for the most part, the old Earth creationists want to put the origin of man, they want to put Adam and Eve roughly 100 to 200,000 years ago, right? And they want to assume the geological column. Therefore, they want to hold to a local flood, which, by the way, Matt, anybody has not yet picked up this book, you can also pick it up on Kindle because it is a big book. So if you prefer Kindle, do that as well. This book is probably the most extensive counter to the local flood joke that you'll ever find. Matt, real quick, actually, before we continue, any rebuttals, any challenges, anything worthy since the release of our new book here?
No, which is quite sad, really. I was hoping for maybe a good review or critique, because a lot of people go through all of our books and all of our work. So I'm thinking the same thing would apply to this one, right? And all you read is, oh, forget that. That's nonsense. It's kind of like, well, that's not really a good review. Even if that was a review, it didn't really. Did you look at it? I mean, I gave it for free for a while. So it's not like there's the excuse of like, oh, I'm not paying for that. Well, okay, you can get the free document that I gave out. But nonetheless, I would have liked the local flood proponents to have checked it out, because it's our model versus their model, right? It's not us versus evolution. This is us saying, like, look, these guys believe in a local flood scenario. They believe in scripture. So do we. So which one makes the most sense? Which one biblically fits and which one scientifically fits? Now, what happened is because they like to use scripture the most, I wanted to do that as well. So the book uses scripture pretty much 75%. And I've tried to find where Eden was, where Noah, where Noah would have been, what he would have made the ark out of. And I think I've found pretty much the answer to all of those things. So I haven't heard a good reply yet, but it's still new. So
well, remember, we also put out, before the release of the book, we put out an hour video with a few aspects of the book, a few aspects to pointing to how we determined the location of the Garden of Eden, a few other arguments. So people who have the excuse that, well, we don't have enough time to go through this encyclopedia, they've got a video
exactly
to review, and they've failed, they've dodged. The critics know that they're cornered, they know that they don't have an argument. But that's what happens when you compromise the Bible, right? You're going to get called out, your arguments are going to get decimated, and essentially you're just going to have to hope and pretend that those arguments don't exist. I appreciate it. Slavic points out, I think you guys are on the best track. You can look at the genetic degeneration and see that we are not evolving but falling apart. Great point. We've been discussing the reality of genetic entropy for years now. We've had numerous debates on it. Matt has had debates on longevity. And we've examined and critiqued all the best so-called rebuttals and arguments against the reality of genetic entropy. And we have decimated them all. We actually have several videos that we've put out over the last 4 months that go unchallenged. So at this point, the critics are just denying that reality. But it's funny that you say this, because I was debating a theistic evolutionist a couple months ago. And what they like to do is slap and run. They like to just make an assertion and then move on. Not on my watch. Don't be slapping and running on my watch. So the slap and run at that point is, well, there's just no evidence for Adam and Eve. Boom, let me go to another topic. I said, hold it. We've been talking about genetic entropy and deleterious mutation accumulation. You had no rebuttal. Okay. Well, take that reality. Take this point of most accumulating mutational damage, this point of highest or greatest genetic load. Take it back to a point in time of least accumulating mutational load, right? Least accumulating mutational damage. That would be a point of perfection, a point of no mutations, and a point where we have genomes of nothing but front-loaded diversity, free from defects, free from mistakes, free from any kind of mutation-related degeneration. And there was no rebuttal, no response, no counter. And I think a light bulb went off at that point where this individual thought, you know what? Yeah. And mutation accumulation can only go back so far. And where you go back to has to be a genome free of mutations. That's the only way it makes sense. And that being said, why don't we just get right into the video now? We've talked about everything we wanted to. We talked about this book. And yeah, let's start playing the video. Matt, maybe we'll play like the first minute or two, then we'll make some comments. I know we got some visuals and some clips to play as well for everybody. So this is going to be fun. Let's get this party started.
All right.
Let me share the audio. And here we go.
Hit that little square there so it gets it'll make it larger. That way you don't have to see this. Yeah.
How's that, brother? Can you hear me?
Yep. Sounds
right,
good.
Here we go. I'm just going to turn it down from the external mic and I'll turn it back up when we're going to talk. You let me know too if you want to pause it.
Okay.
You have the materials inside you right now to unlock the story of your deep, distant ancestry. And also mine. That's partly because you have mitochondria in your cells. And you got them only from your mother.
Right off the bat, I just want to say yes. I just want to say, yes, we agree. So one thing we agree with, yes. Remember, as we were talking about, the direct line of evidence to determine and answer the question of ancestry, it's in our genetics. It's not in a rock. It's not in geology. Okay. It's not in their precious dating methods. It's not in the stars. It's in genetics. That's how we can answer the question of ancestry. That's how we can determine which model is true, separate or universal. And universal would also fit in with deep time, even the deep time old earth creationists, that although they don't hold a universal, they do still erroneously put Adam and Eve back to 200,000 years. So just wanted to point that out. Here we go.
Mother, not your father. And if on your 23rd pair of chromosomes you have an X and a Y, like I do, rather than an X and an X, then you got that Y chromosome only from your father. Together, these two facts mean that there's an unbroken line of mothers and mothers' mothers who passed down the DNA in their mitochondria for hundreds of millennia, creating a biological thread that connects you to a single female ancestor, regardless of your gender. And it also means that there's a lineage of fathers and fathers' fathers who passed on their Y chromosome uninterrupted, leading back to a single male ancestor. Okay, now I know what this might sound like. I'm not talking about the first two people. I'm talking about two humans who lived at different times in the distant past, about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. I'm talking about two people who never met, but who, because of this odd quirk of genetics combined with some unique evolutionary circumstances, managed to pass on a very small fraction of their genomes to you, and to me, to all of us. And this is an incredibly powerful tool for studying where we all came from. We're only beginning to understand the legacy of these two people to whom we're all related. It's a legacy that goes back some 10,000 generations. Let's talk about where this legacy begins in your own cells. Your mitochondria are the small structures that produce energy for your cells, and they're relics from a time more than 2 billion years ago when our ancestor was single-celled, and at some point it engulfed another single-celled organism and started using it as an energy supply. As a result, mitochondria today still have their own, if very short, genomes. This is your mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, and it's only passed down from the mother because egg cells have lots of mitochondria, but sperm cells only have a little, and they're destroyed after fertilization. Meanwhile, the Y chromosome is the smaller of the two sex chromosomes, X and Y. People with an X and a Y instead of two X's are physiologically male, and there's a reason we study mitochondrial genomes and Y chromosomes to understand our ancestry. Actually, two reasons, because they have two important things.
And this is good what he's going through right now. He already said some things wrong, obviously, that we have tens of thousands, or we have 10,000 generations in the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. We don't. We're going to go over that later. We've shown over and over again these phylogenetic trees pertaining to mitochondrial DNA Y chromosome. We don't see thousands of generations. We don't see tens of thousands of mutations. We really only see very few mutations, and therefore only a couple hundred to a few hundred generations. So he's kind of just making assertions there, but he will get into it a little bit more detailed later. So let me play another maybe 30 seconds, Matt, and then we'll kind of just work backwards, go through it all.
Okay.
In common. Their genomes are both pretty short, and they also don't recombine. Okay, here's what that means. In the process of creating sperm and egg cells, our chromosomes line up and exchange information. Matched pairs of chromosomes swap arms or legs with each other. This molecular do-si-do is known as recombination, and it means that offspring will have slightly different combinations of genes on each of its chromosomes than its parents had. This is basically how sex creates new genetic variations. But Y chromosomes are much smaller than X's, and unlike the rest of our chromosomes, it doesn't match its partner, so it doesn't recombine with the X. And the mitochondrial genome doesn't recombine with anything either, because it doesn't have a partner to combine with. All of this means that these two snippets of genetic information get passed on almost unchanged from parent to offspring, which makes them traceable through time. So for decades, scientists have been studying.
Exactly right. The mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome are our uniparentally inherited DNA compartments, right? They're more stable in the sense that they still accumulate mutations, obviously, in the sense that, as he pointed out, they're non-recombining DNA, right? The nuclear DNA, for example, we pass on 2 copies, but the mitochondrial DNA we get from our mother, Y chromosome we get from our father. So they are the perfect DNA compartments to trace ancestry, trace our history and lineages. That's why they're so important, especially from a creationist perspective. We hold to the created heterozygosity hypothesis. So that assumes that the majority of nuclear DNA is actually created nuclear DNA heterozygosity. But when it comes to the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, Matt, as you know, we would agree for the most part with the evolutionist that any differences in those DNA compartments are the result of mutation. So that's where we can have a head-to-head debate and make head-to-head predictions on those specific DNA compartments. So let me go through, kind of reiterate some of the basics here, Matt, and then I'm going to hand it over to you, okay, brother? Especially for anybody new, we're about to hit 6,000 subscribers. There may be people in the chat that Because they're new to this channel, they might not have seen our extensive videos on this topic over the years. So I kind of just want to move back to where he was explaining the basics and kind of reiterate it in a way that is understandable to everybody, but also from more of the biblical perspective, where we're coming from, okay? So we know, as I pointed out, that there exists the nuclear DNA. But then there's these two types of DNA that only comes from one side or the other. For example, we have the Y chromosome that, as I pointed out, comes from our father, and the mitochondrial DNA, which comes from our mother. Okay. You've probably heard that the mitochondrial DNA are the powerhouses or work horses of the cell. It is maternally inherited, while the Y chromosome is paternally inherited. That's why we could hypothetically detect our last male ancestor in the Y chromosome, Noah, which would then go back to Adam. From the mitochondrial DNA, we can track back to Eve. We could also use mitochondrial DNA haplogroups to go back to Noah's 3 daughters-in-law, which is why we see 3 major haplogroups for the most part, L, M, and N, which is fascinating evidence for the biblical-based model. So, for example, I have, let's say, mitochondrial DNA, okay? I have it, Matt has it, and we got it from our mothers. And then my 2 children, soon to be 3, probably in the next month or 2, time flies by, have my wife's mitochondrial DNA. And these DNA compartments give us a way to look deep into the past and answer the important question of ancestry, as this, as the speaker here admitted in the first 10 seconds of the video. The secularists, though, they'll base their dates, and you can already tell he's assuming this with his assertions right off the bat. The secularists will base their dates off indirect lines of evidence, okay? They will say mitochondrial Eve lived about 200,000 years ago in Africa. And this is based off of what? Geology and archaeology. And they're not getting or deriving this answer from direct genetic evidence. Essentially, they're saying, well, according to these other scientific fields, right, and data points, then Eve must have lived this long ago, or Adam must have lived this long ago. Now, they don't actually think Eve and Adam, mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, are the biblical Adam and Eve, right? They named these ancestors that. And it's kind of tongue-in-cheek because the data actually turns out to corroborate just that, the Bible. They don't like that, though. So anyways, yeah, they're using assumption-based methods. It's not empirical. As you're going to see throughout this video, we prefer the empirical method. We prefer straightforward coalescence calculations. It's that simple, okay? So what we can do, since we know mutations are inherited, genetic mistakes, is we can then measure DNA and how it changes, how frequently it changes. For example, let's say we took a look at my DNA and my kid's DNA, or Matt's DNA and his kid's DNA, or my DNA and my parents' DNA. We're going to see differences. Differences accumulate. That's what we're going to see. Mistakes happen from generation to generation. Now, in the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, of course, mistakes occur. And when we measure the rate of this change in real time, empirically, let's say we take, let's say we took grandmothers and granddaughters, or even better, let's say we took 2 ladies who we know share a common great-great-great-great-grandmother in the distant past, right? Well, we can look at their DNA sequences, their mitochondrial DNA sequences, and by comparing them, we can, through straightforward and empirical means, determine a mutation rate, right? Does that make sense? And the answer that we've gotten is a very fast, much too fast, very inconsistent rate with deep time evolution, way faster than the deep time proponents have ever predicted. And the number of DNA differences and also the mutation rate itself turns out to fit perfectly with the biblical model of ancestry. And the last thing I'll say is the data that we have for the uniparentally inherited DNA compartments, the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, is actually led to, and I discussed this for a couple hours the other day, it has led to active research in determining, Matt, as you know, the history of civilization, and the results have been fascinating. Confirmed predictions that can only be true if these DNA compartments really only go back between 4,500 and 6,000 years. And these results, again, have only been possible because the reality is that the history of man only goes back 6,000 years. Okay, so I hope that kind of made sense, and I hope that really broke it down for everybody. Matt, I want to hand it over to you, brother.
Sure. Yeah, the only thing I would add is that when you get a genetic test done, let's say 23andme.com, and you order a genetic test and you spit in the cup and send it off. If you're a female, all you're going to have coming back as far as an answer is concerned is the mitochondria, meaning you're only going to know what your mother inherited to you. Because you're not a male, you don't have the Y chromosome, so you're only going to learn about half of your ancestry. As where a male, on the other hand, we would be able to send in the genetic test and see both lineages and what we might have inherited from both mother and father. And as far as mutation rates go, mitochondria is a much smaller section, meaning it's about 16,569 base pairs. And you can also, they discovered recently, is you also inherit some mitochondria from the male side. So there ends up being different mitochondria in the same person. So this is what threw off the mutation rate clocks for quite a while. The first problem is you don't inherit one mutation per person per generation. You actually inherit less than that. So it becomes very hard to count when you're dealing with like half a mutation. So the other problem is that when we are testing mitochondria, some of them tick really, really fast, and then some of them tick really, really slow, and then some are broken and don't tick at all. And so they're going, what's going on here? So only recently did we discover that people can carry multiple types of mitochondria that are different inside their body, and it's called heteroplasmy. But when it comes to the Y chromosome, it's much larger. And being much larger, it's much easier to count because more mutations shows us that we're able to go, well, how many more mutations are being handed down a generation? Well, we can say, well, about 3 every generation. See, 3 is much easier to count than 0.24. And especially if it changes. So when there's a slow mutation rate and a person passes on 2, you can still count that really easy. And if it's fast, you get 5 really easy. But mitochondria, when it's slow, you're dealing with like 0.2, and when it's fast, you're dealing with 0.5. So there's a small range, but it's very hard to see. So this is what's funny is now we have both evidence for both of those things, the Y chromosome and mitochondria, and they point to different people. That is true. But we're going to explain why that is and how we actually have the timeline for them later.
Awesome. Yeah, let's play a little bit more of the video, and then we'll kind of get into that because we do have a lot of data. But I hope that those explanations were helpful to people. Also, at 2 a.m, at least my time, and we've got a great chat. You know, we've had 40 people in the chat, and I appreciate the support. Doki, Caleb, God bless you guys. Of course, any questions or anything as well, we do like to be interactive. Feel free to tag us. Feel free to let us know. And okay. And also, let us know, guys, how the audio, video, and all of that's coming in. So let's get right back to the video, Matt. Here we go. Share audio. And okay.
These 2 bits of information. And they tell 2 stories about our history that are slightly different, but still complement each other. For example, one of the most important things we've learned about ourselves from mitochondrial DNA is the story.
Echo.
Even though it's passed on from mother to child without recombining, mtDNA does slowly accumulate mutations. And as those mutations get passed on within a population, they start to form a genetic pattern within that group. This allows scientists to organize us into genetically similar groups called haplogroups. Anyone who's used a DNA test kit has heard of these. So if you and another person share most of these mitochondrial mutations, then you belong to the same haplogroup. And decades of research into mtDNA has shown that the vast majority of haplogroup diversity exists inside Africa. For example, there are several haplogroups that are only found in Africa or among people of African descent. These are groups like L0, L1, L2, and L4, 5, and 6. But the whole rest of the world is represented by parts of only one haplogroup. That's L3. So if you're of non-African descent, you belong to L3. L3, which contains lots of subgroups like K, M, N, and R, which are found among populations outside Africa. But there are even more subgroups of L3 found within Africa. So what does all this tell us? Well, for one thing, it's taken as genetic evidence for what's known as the out-of-Africa hypothesis, the hypothesis that modern humans originated in Africa and spread throughout the world. This model was first developed by anthropologists around the 1980s based on skeletal evidence, specifically the earliest anatomically modern humans that were found in southern and eastern Africa. And today, this mitochondrial data is seen as molecular support for that idea, starting with a famous paper published in the journal Nature in 1987. That paper detected the first signs of these genetic patterns based on mtDNA sampled from just 147 people from 5 different geographic populations. But among other things, that study showed us that there's such a great diversity of haplogroups in Africa because that's where our genetic populations are oldest. So when a small group of people migrated out of Africa, they only represented some of the genes in the total human gene pool. Those migrants.
All right, so quite a bit there, Matt. We got into, Africa supposedly being the oldest population based on a number of factors. Yeah, why don't you kind of kick us off, brother? What are your thoughts, and what are the first few things you wanted to address?
Sure. One thing he said is that he was correct. He said we have something called mitochondria and it accumulates mutations. So what he means by that is every single generation, you're inheriting more mutations. Some of those mutations are going to be harmful. Very, very few might be beneficial. And the majority are what are called near neutral, meaning they have a little bit of effect on the body, but selection can't see them, meaning they're invisible to your body. Your body can't remove them. So they accumulate and they keep accumulating. And this is a problem that they found in population genetics and Crow's concern. There's a whole bunch of different names for it. One of the most popular ones is Why Aren't We Dead? 100 Times Over by Kondrashov. And basically what they've discovered is that these accumulating mutations just can't keep happening. And if they do keep happening, then we should be able to detect that. Meaning we can look inside the mitochondria and say, how full is it? So if I give you a glass and I start pouring water into that glass, how much of it can get full until it reaches a saturation point? Well, if I have a hole near the top, it won't be able to fill all the way up, but it can get to the hole before it starts pouring out. That would be a saturation point. Now, if deep time evolution was true, what would happen is as those mutations are accumulating in the cup, like the water being poured in, it would reach a saturation point, and the water and the mutations would essentially be turning over the same point, and you could no longer see new mutations coming into the system. But what's happening is we keep seeing new mutations accumulating. So we know one thing from that alone is that deep time isn't true because saturation hasn't happened yet. And the mitochondria should be saturated, not just human beings, but all life on Earth. But nothing is even close to a mutational saturation. Everything has a very low amount of mutations in it. But how could that possibly be true if the mutation rate is fast? The only possible answer to that is young Earth creation. I can go on if you want. How about this then? Look at, let me see. Look at mutation rate, for example, okay? So let's give evolution the benefit of the doubt and say that the mutation rate is extremely slow. I'm not talking a half a mutation every generation or a half a mutation a generation. I'm going to give 0.03 mutations per generation. Now, completely unheard of, but let's do it anyway. That means in a population of 5,000 females that produce another 5,000 females, there would be a minimum of about 150 new harmful mutations spread across the entire next generation with 500,000 near neutral mutations. And this is in one generation. So now imagine genetic drift trying to deal with removing these mutations. All it can handle would probably be about 150 mutations before it exceeds the level of new mutations being created every new generation. So therefore we have mtDNA trees not being split into 2 haplogroups or even 3, but within the span of just a few generations, you get an explosion of new haplogroups. And that's exactly what we'd see in our model. And that is what we see worldwide. We don't see new haplogroups forming really today, but we would see that in an explosion of people getting off the ark, migrating, going around, going to Babel, losing their ability to communicate, language dispersity. They go out, massive amounts of mutations are accumulating in the population that's growing. Then we have people stuck in Africa, small populations, no farming, small subgroups of people, mutations occurring fast, fixation reaching quickly. Boom, recipe for disaster that makes it seem like Africans have been there longer when it's just not true. So hopefully that wasn't too advanced, but
No, that was good, brother. That was good. I wanted you to address as much as you can, and so many good points, and some of our favorite topics. So it's even hard to decide, where are we going to start. I've got so many slides on this, and you know what? I think I know where I want to start, and it has to do with this assumption, for one, of evolution to prove evolution, right? Or deep time to prove deep time. And they make these assertions that, well, Africans, they're older because, there's greater levels of diversity. You debunked that. You had a great explanation for that. While when you look at the raw data, the empirical data, and an example of this is from the HAT-MAT project. Okay, when we look at the raw data, Matt, we see that the genome is young. Without any assumptions, we know that the genome is young, and they have examined, and I like the way Dr. Rob Carter put this, okay? They've examined millions of variants in thousands of people from around the world, and they've made this data. This data is easily available. And in a nutshell, he points out a few things that we learned, at least from this specific project, okay? So he points out that the human genome is young, shared blocks of DNA are large, and there has not been enough time to scramble them to randomness. So remember, when we have these processes known as recombination and gene conversion, okay, and that the genome is recombined and DNA variants are scrambled for the most part from generation to generation. Well, what's funny is we still have these massive blocks of DNA in the human genome that appear to have never been scrambled. They are completely intact, which is interesting because young Earth creationist PhDs have gone about determining Adam and Eve's original sequence because we see these original text strings in the genome. Now, here's the thing. If humans actually do go back a couple 100,000 years, well, then the genome should be much more scrambled. There should be much more evidence for recombination, gene conversion. We see enough recombination and gene conversion. We see enough for a few thousand years, as the biblical model of ancestry would point out. And this population, say 200,000 years ago, they would have came from, right? Populations evolve over time. They would, according to the deep time evolutionary model, at least, they would go back to past ancestors who over time would also be experiencing recombination and gene conversion. Their DNA variants would be scrambled as well. They would be scrambling every single generation. And therefore, we shouldn't see these massive linkage blocks that have no evidence for any separation and any recombination. The same thing goes with diversity. Humans have low genetic diversity. We're all 99.999% similar. So if we actually do go back a couple 100,000 years, and since we know the mutation rate is high in the nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome, and a mutation adds diversity, mutation is adding something that was not previously there. It's adding diversity, right? So even if we went back a couple 100,000 years, and even if there was a massive near extinction population bottleneck, we should still have much more diversity today. We should also have divergent people groups on the planet that are more divergent than each other. But no, the Y chromosomes, every single male Y chromosome on the planet is nearly identical, mitochondrial DNA, nuclear DNA. And from the evolutionary model, if we've been evolving from the Australopithecines up to Homo habilis, up to Homo erectus lived on the earth for millions of years, and eventually Homo sapiens, okay, then that would be millions of years of mutations adding diversity. That's actually why they look to this near extinction event, because they realized, wow, human diversity is so low today, that shouldn't be the case. How do we explain this? Well, they had to retrofit the data. They had to come up with a rescue device, an ad hoc explanation. Well, there must have been a near extinction event or near extinction events at some point in the past. So let me keep going. The human population came from a single source. Most blocks are shared among all world populations, and the human genome is falling apart. Deletions tend to not be shared among populations, but are unique to subpopulations. This is further evidence for the youth of the genome and that we came from a single source population. Another thing I wanted to touch on, Matt, and you can certainly touch on this too, as this is important for our model, is something called patriarchal drive. Okay. And I have a slide here to help people on. And this actually also helps explain people groups, extinct people groups, such as the Neanderthals, right? Why they are genetically different than Homo sapiens today. According to the biblical model, and we have evidence for this, I'd recommend, Matt, people watch your lecture on biblical longevity, right? You'll have scoffers. Well, there's no evidence that man lived to 900. No, there's plenty of irrefutable evidence. So for sake of time, I recommend people go watch that lecture. So the point is, if people are living longer, especially men, if men are living longer in the past, then what we would be having is biblical patriarchs who lived into their hundreds. They would then be having kids at really old ages, right? So if you have really old people having children late in their lives, a lot later than today, people don't live to 100, 200, 300, 400, so on and so forth. They would be producing children with a ton of mutations. A really old biblical patriarch would pass on, triple the mutations oftentimes than today. This is important when it comes to men, because men's reproductive cells start dividing at puberty and do not stop dividing until they die. Older men can also have children later in life. And what patriarchal drive would do, if you want to expand on this in a bit, Matt, you can. The result of it would be that early biblical patriarchs could be producing kids with very long branch lengths right at the beginning. This actually makes it even worse for deep time proponents because, and I'll go here because I've got the slide pretty well pulled up. When we look at these phylogenetic trees, for example, this is a mitochondrial DNA phylogenetic tree, and this is a Y chromosome. You can't look at the branch lengths and make assumptions like the evolutionists do on the molecular clock. You also can't look at the branch lengths, or you can't look at these phylogenetic trees and make assumptions based on when humans and chimpanzees split. No, we know on both these mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome trees, we know that for one, you'll oftentimes see branch lengths in the same haplogroup, like the HVR haplogroup in Europe when it comes to the mitochondrial DNA. They have differing branch lengths, differing sizes, which means people, are picking up more mutations than other people in the same amount of time. More mutations the same amount of time. The point is, we see low variation, few mutations in both DNA compartments, but a fast mutation rate. Now, the point I'm trying to make, does this make sense, Matt? With patriarchal drive, that actually makes it even worse for the deep time proponent, because now we not only have low variation, but we also have patriarchal drive in the past, which means from the young Earth creation model, and patriarchal drive specifically applies to the Y chromosome, mind you. But the diversity we see today is just so incredibly easy to explain from a young Earth creation model and time scale. While it's very difficult for deep time proponents, they're coming up with rescue device after rescue device. Does that make sense, Matt? Did you want to expand on it, brother?
Yeah, basically, when we look into scripture, we see people that live for hundreds and hundreds of years old, and we're like, well, we don't see anybody living to that age today. So are these mythical ages, or are these true? Well, as young Earth creationists, we don't just go, well, they're true, but who cares? It just doesn't matter. No, we go, well, let's test that. That's what patriarchal drive did. They said, well, let's see what would happen if somebody extremely old did have a kid. So what they did is they used 3 models that were basically 2 of them were peer reviewed, and the other one was put through a program. Essentially, it was a simulator to run it to see how it would do. And what they did is they said, well, Noah is the oldest person that we know of in scripture to have kids. And if all the people today funnel from Noah then that would mean that the entire world had to come from his 3 kids. So therefore, any mutations that he passed on would affect the whole world. So it would have been very different if it was Adam and Eve, because remember, they started having kids right after the fall. So they would have essentially had children that were nearly almost perfect like they were. That's why we don't see any decline in the lifespan of the patriarchs. And then at the flood, it's a steep decline because Noah was 500 years old. So you can imagine the thousands and thousands and thousands of mutations that he passed on just to his kids. So by looking at patriarchal drive, we do see that biological decay curve that shows how the linear age decline matches what we see in genetics from inbreeding, and a huge decline from what we would get from somebody that high age. So we have the genetic evidence that actually lines up with what scripture tells us when we look at those ages in scripture. So that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very good point, brother. And the fact that young Earth creationists can actually make predictions on mutation rates, the fact that young Earth creationists can make predictions pertaining to the history of civilization based on the raw data really is fascinating. And I wanted to cover a little bit more of this out of Africa idea, right? And maybe we can touch on the PRDM9 enzyme too, or gene in a bit here. But this whole idea that the speaker in the video is putting forth, that Africans are older and therefore the human genome goes back further than 6,000 years, they'll say that refutes the biblical time frame. But they have so many assumptions going into that. And Matt, you touched on a couple of these explanations as well, but there are many assumptions involved as always, right? The Out of Africa story assumes that higher levels of diversity in Africa prove man came from Africa. That's exactly what he was explaining. And that therefore Africans are older than other people groups. But African diversity can better be explained in terms of how human diversity was subdivided after the biblical dispersion out of Babel. The divergence of the people groups does not require a slow accumulation of mutations over time, the molecular clock, but can arise essentially instantly by fragmentation of the source population and strong founder effects followed by assortative mating. People group divergence is most consistent with a very recent fragmentation of the human race. It also goes back to what we were talking about when it comes to these linkage groups, where we have the original text strings of our last common ancestors, Noah and Eve. There's not evidence of hundreds of thousands to millions of years of recombination, gene conversion, and these processes that would have scrambled the genome a lot more. And did you want to touch on the PRDM9 gene as well in terms of how that empirical data helps answer this question of recombination and African diversity?
Sure. We know a couple things right now. For those of you that are new to this, evolution holds to what's called the neutral theory. It's that all things mutate at the same rate. So if I'm sitting here and then we drive down the block and we just grab a random stranger and he's sitting next to me, they expect that we're both mutating at exactly the same rate. So therefore, an African would mutate at the same rate as a European, that would mutate at the same rate as an Asian. But what we know now is that this is not true at all. So therefore, neutral theory is invalid. We both have a study on this you guys can read. What I mean by this is we know for a fact that neutral theory is wrong, even looking at Europeans only. When Parsons first did his study in 1997, he ran a mutation rate looking at Europeans, and he actually found that it wasn't just Europeans, but it was a group in Europeans as well, known as the Amish, who mutate 14% slower than other Europeans. So you can't hold that neutral theory is true while there's people mutating at different rates, even within the same haplogroup. So if we know that people are mutating at different rates even today, then why would that not hold the case for humanity throughout time? Of course, there's going to be different rates. Now, what would cause some of these different rates? As young Earth creationists, we would say that one of the major factors has to do with the generation times. The shorter a generation time, the more generations you're going to have, the more mutations you're going to have. So therefore, we're going to see more mutations, looks like deeper time. So take, for instance, if Africans have a population or generation time of 15 years and 5,000 years passes, and then Europeans have the exact same amount of time, 5,000 years, but their generation time averages 30 years, who's going to have more mutations? Clearly Africans, because they're literally going to have twice as many generations. So it makes logical sense that there's going to be more diversity based on that. But there's the other thing, this is what Standing for Truth was saying, is that we also have other things in us that can dictate mutations. Where can mutations also speed up? Well, mutations can actually be enhanced by recombination. Therefore, PRDM9 means more sites for mutations to take effect in. So imagine Neanderthals found. Neanderthal has a larger genome, just like Denisovan. So they have larger genomes with more PRDM9. So they have a larger genome, which means more areas where mutations can take effect. And then they have more PRDM9 sites where mutations can happen. We have what looks like an older, group of people, but it's not. It's a smaller group of people living a long time, building up more mutations than they should, inbreeding, causing lots of genetic mistakes with bigger genomes, more PRDM9, and they're isolated in small groups. That's a recipe for disaster. In Africa, they didn't have the ice age. They didn't have to contend with hunting mammoth for food. So they got isolated. The Sahara Desert started to form, and they were stuck in Africa with small populations. And the reason the population always stayed small in Africa, as where we didn't have to worry about that as Europeans and Asians, is because farming in Africa really just doesn't take place. It never really has either. One of the main reasons could be animals. They've shown hippos coming out of the rivers and just devouring anytime they try to plant anything. That's why people go over there and they try to plant crops for the poor people, and the hippos come out of the water and eat everything. So farming is still hard even today. So as you would imagine, without farming, you can't grow a large population. So that means small population sizes are always going to accumulate more mutations and reach fixation faster. Therefore, when we look at Africans, we go, oh, they have a ton of mutations. They must be older. No, that paradigm is dead now.
And what's interesting about what you said there, Matt, is, and after I say this, I'm going to go over some of these slides and sources here too, just to show everybody in the chat that this data that we're providing you is data from the secular literature. This isn't just young Earth creationists making this stuff up. But with smaller populations, a fast mutation rate, we therefore have rapid fixation of new variants, new mutations, right? Well, it is the biblical model, Matt, which after the flood, we have 8 people. Noah's wife, of course, Noah's 3 sons and their wives, okay? Well, with such a small population, okay, right after the flood, and also at the Tower of Babel, we would have thousands of people that are all living in the same area. They did not follow God's command to spread out all over the earth. What does that mean pertaining to the average substitutions in the human population? Okay. And really how easily it is for the young Earth creation model to explain simply by looking to those 2 bottlenecks after the flood.
Well, it comes down to population size. When any time a new mutation is going to reach a fixation, what that means is, how long does it take to walk to the top of a pyramid that's small? Not very long. The more people, the larger the pyramid, the longer it's going to take to get to the top. Fixation is the top of that pyramid. So in today's world, imagine a person with a new eye color, a new mutation. Let's say it's purple and it's very dominant and it's never been seen before. How long before everybody in America has purple eyes? oh man, we would never see it in our lifetime, of course. But if I live in a small tribe of people, like let's say Native Americans with 12 people, and a kid's born with purple eyes and it's a dominant gene, how long before that mutation saturation happens before that entire tribe has purple eyes? Well, just a few generations, and then fixation is reached. So when we see small populations of Africans, fixation is reached very quickly.
Right. Great points. Great points. Which means the few substitutions that we see, right, in the mitochondrial DNA, we can also look at Y chromosome diversity worldwide. It's all very easily explainable from the young Earth creation model of ancestry. We have fast mutation rates. When it comes to the Y chromosome, we have patriarchal drive. We also have our bottlenecks after the flood. We also know that these small populations would have, what would have followed was rapid and exponential growth. It's just fascinating that what we see in terms of worldwide diversity, and then focusing in on these uniparentally DNA compartments is exactly what we'd expect from the biblical model. When it comes to the PRDM9, the fact that these sites control activation of mammalian recombination hotspots, it is very interesting when you consider the design diversity hypothesis that God would have created Adam and Eve with front-loaded genetic diversity, front-loaded DNA differences. We also know, based on the DNA function-related data, that God would have front-loaded these DNA elements, such as retrotransposons as well, that are functional and beneficial. Then we look at these PRDM9 sites, and since we know mutations destroy them over time, right? We go all the way back to creation, where you have Adam and Eve with this design diversity, and therefore more working PRDM9 sites, you'd have more effective recombination and gene conversion. The whole point is these deep time proponents, when they go into the data, they have a lot of assumptions that are not realistic. They're erroneous assumptions. And I find this to be a fascinating excerpt from a paper called The Landscape of Recombination in African Americans. Okay. And it talks about how in people of West African ancestry, there's been a shift in recombination in the recombination landscape compared with people of non-African ancestry. The larger number of hotspots available to West Africans implies that at the population level, crossovers are more evenly distributed than Europeans. And thus the shorter extent of West African linkage disequilibrium is not due to differences in demographic history alone, such as the lack of an out of Africa founder event. So the point is, genetic diversity does not automatically mean, for example, like Africans have more genetic diversity. That doesn't automatically mean that it's an older population. There are many other reasons other than age as to why a population of humans can harbor more genetic diversity. What are your thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, if you guys are familiar with our work, you might know that there are different regions, even within the mitochondria itself, that are hotspots. For example, you know, the mitochondria is just a round circle when we look at it from a visual standpoint, when we're looking at it from a drawing, not the actual mitochondria itself, but the D loop. That's why they call it a D loop. Even inside the D loop, there are hotspots. Now there's hypervariable regions 1 and 2. Hypervariable region 1, for example, is a hotspot. It turns over mutations extremely fast. So that being a hotspot. Now imagine if there were other areas in the genome, like hypervariable region 1 and 2, ticking in mutations, and now they're gone in a population size. One, it would slow the mutation rate down. It wouldn't speed it up. It would slow it down. So that would help evolution. And yet they're still fast. We can still explain genetic diversity through a young Earth creationist model. And it also shows that if the genome was perfect and better going into the past, like Neanderthal and Denisovan, not being subhumans, but actual humans with a bigger genome and recombination hotspots, we would actually expect them to have more genetic diversity because these haven't been broken by mutation yet. So what happens is, imagine 10 D loops with more hotspots turning mutations over. Man, they would have so many mutations in them, they would look extremely old, more like, or like a primitive person. So when people go, well, evolution doesn't have any evidence, well, that is their evidence. Their assumption is that these are not human beings from modern day times. They must be old because they have so many mutations in them. How could these be a population of people after the flood that only lived for a few hundred years if they have more mutations than people alive today that have lived for thousands of years? Well, that's easy, because small groups of people, tons of hotspots, because their genome was good, fast rates of mutation occurring, inbreeding going on. They were a genetic mess, and they had a better genome. So not everything was broken yet. Now it's broken, so we're missing a lot of those. So that just explains what I believe when we look at Denisovan and Neanderthal. It explains the genetic diversity in those rare people groups that were extremely small.
That's a great point. So many great points, brother. Another rescue device they look to, or an assumption, is this idea of coalescence, right? And what they want to do is, well, essentially coalescence theory. It proposes that when you have enough generations, you're eventually going to trace back to just two common ancestors, right? Because we point out we've literally discovered Adam, Eve, and Noah. Noah being our last Y chromosomal ancestor 4,500 years ago. We point out we've discovered these ancestors in our genetics. Everything points to that. Mitochondrial DNA variation, Y chromosome DNA variation, the low genetic diversity, even in the nuclear DNA. So they say, well, given coalescence theory, we'd expect that. Eventually, you're just going to trace back to two common ancestors anyways, even in the deep time model. But even that theory and that explanation has countless unrealistic assumptions. And we've pointed out in the past, Matt, that one of them is random mating. And this is where you have a population that all the people in that population have a strong likelihood of mating and marrying. Okay. But historically, this is not accurate. Humans have existed in tribes, and tribes that have been separated from each other. There is no random mating. And there's actually no reason at all why the Y chromosomal sequence, Y chromosome Noah, and the mitochondrial Eve sequence, okay, they're so unique. There's no reason why they had to fit perfectly with the biblical model of ancestry, the origins as recorded in the Bible, and especially the mitochondrial DNA. If evolution was true, then this mitochondrial DNA ancestor could have shared many lines with chimpanzees if they were really related. So no, the data that we see is not also expected by deep time and universal common ancestry. So that's just, as we know, Matt, what's called retrofitting the data. Okay, this data didn't have to be true, but the Bible predicted it. And the Bible tells us that Adam is the first man, Eve is the mother of all living. Jesus says from the beginning of creation, he made them male and female, pointing back to day 6, where he created Adam and Eve. The scientific data perfectly corroborates this. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
No, a couple things. The interesting thing is okay, let's say that they were true. Okay, let's say that this was a hypothetical scenario. They have a couple problems. They've got to retrofit this data to say that, well, people were stuck in Africa. The out of Africa was much later, only 50,000 years ago, probably. That way they can force everybody into one little region and not have a dispersion. But that ends up biting them in the butt, because now they have small populations where fixation would reach so quickly. You would have far more than only 24 fixed substitutions in all of humanity. but we only find 24 total. Another problem is, how come none of the observable mutation rates land anywhere close to 200,000 to 300,000 years ago when they've assumed their population happened? How come they land around our model of what we would predict if young Earth creation were true? They land so far away from the evolutionary model that they want to nitpick and say, look, those numbers pointed at 6,500 years old in the Parsons study. You're off by 500 years. Well, okay, you just admitted that you're off by 295,000 years. How does that help you? They're so busy pointing the finger saying, you guys are off, you guys are off. They forget how far off they are. So why would the numbers even remotely approach what we would assume the genealogies going back in scripture say, as opposed to what the evidence is? It just,
and here's an error on their part. You constantly hear the critics misrepresent our position. They're saying that all the mutation rate studies, you know, they just go back, bam, right to 6,000 years. Matt, can you explain why that's a straw man? And then also I've put forth a couple slides here, especially one pertaining to the Parsons paper and Gibbons' assessment of it. Why that's significant here.
Sure. Yeah, when we're looking at mutation rate studies, we look at all of them. Some of them don't show 6,000 years. The reason for that can be that what they were studying themselves. Remember, some studies are trying to figure out who's related to who. Some are looking for disease. Some aren't even trying to get a most recent common ancestor. Some only study hypervariable region 2. Well, that's going to be a very different outcome than if you study hypervariable region 1. You're actually supposed to study both of them. Some of them exclude heteroplasmy, which is taking all the different mitochondria into consideration. So you're going to get studies with vast amounts of different answers and conclusions because the studies themselves are looking for different answers and conclusions. They're not all trying to discover. Matter of fact, one study was just on haplogroups of Europeans, like when was the first European human? And a woman named Anne actually did the study to determine how many generations ago did this person live. It ended up being around like 260 generations ago, the first European. Well, it lands around when we would assume it was going to happen, but it sure doesn't land any time around when they would assume this was going to happen. So you're going to get different answers because different studies are looking for different answers. That's the first answer to that question. Another one is, yeah, you have to look at what the study is actually testing as well, not what their outcome is going to be. Are they looking at a particular region only? Are they neglecting heteroplasmy? Because all of those are going to give you different results. All we have to do as people that love science and as people that are young Earth creationists is be able to give you the explanation of genetic diversity. Can we explain it in our model? Yes, there are extremely fast mutation rates in multiple studies that can prove that a recent common ancestor to humanity went back just a few thousand years ago. Evolution also has to hold to that same standard. They have to be able to prove their model. They can't do it without inventing a mutation rate, and they did that. They invented the phylogenetic rate because their model isn't true, so they had to invent another lie to cover up another lie. We just look at the data and read it and go, okay, it's a little hard to explain with this, but you know what? The fastest mutation rate still gives us a great answer, and that's what's so great about the Y chromosome rate study. Like I was telling you, it's easy to count, and the genetic evidence is really strong in that area.
It really is amazing that it turns out that the Y chromosome is some of our best evidence for young Earth creation, especially the young Earth creation model of ancestry, given how after examining these high quality sequencing studies and data, we have a Y chromosome that mutates incredibly fast. And yet every single male Y chromosome on the planet is nearly identical. Well, isn't that funny? The only way to explain a fast mutating Y chromosome and a Y chromosome that's nearly identical worldwide in men, and a Y chromosome that is nothing like the chimpanzee Y chromosome. Okay, when you consider overall architecture, gene content, size differences, it's only about 35% like with the chimpanzee Y chromosome. All of these things combined, the only answer is the Y chromosome's young. That's it. And we hear, these constant arguments from people like Dodgeball Dan, Stern Cardinal, who has really just tapped out and failed at this point. We've done several videos in the last maybe 4 months debunking his latest rescue devices, and he's just given up. He hasn't been able to respond to them. He still dodges and ignores the differentiating lines of evidence, but he also says, we don't understand the difference between, pedigree rates and phylogenetic rates, in that, when we're measuring mutations in real time, we know that some mutations will be weeded out, right? They look to an answer of purifying selection for the most part, and bottlenecks, genetic drift, to explain the low variation with a fast mutation rate anyways. But I found this funny because Dr. Rob Carter demolished the arguments from Joshua Swamidass, Dodgeball Dan, and Guts Gibbon recently. And no sound rebuttal, just a lot of dodging. Even Dr. Carter has recognized that that's what they do, is they don't address the arguments. So Dr. Carter pointed out, Dodgeball Dan, claims I misunderstand, right? Dan always says we misunderstand these things, right? The substitution rate versus the mutation rate. And I thought that was interesting, because Carter pointed out, I am perfectly well aware that the long-term substitution rate is not the same as the genealogical mutation rate. However, and this is important, over long periods of time in a population in mutation to drift equilibrium, the two are nearly equal.
Yep.
There is also not, as he claims, a conflict between the thought that A, most mutations are lost to drift, and B, the mutation rate is approximately the same as the fixation rate. Why? Because even if most mutations are lost, in a large population, many are not. And I like how he points this out. This is basic population genetics. So anybody that was here at the beginning, our first kind of rebuttal to the first part of this video we're doing is we talked about why these DNA compartments, Y chromosome, mitochondrial DNA, are so important in answering the question of ancestry. We also talked about how we can get a mutation rate, how we can measure a mutation rate in real time through pedigree-based mutation rate studies, right? By taking grandmother, granddaughter, or taking two ladies who we know share a common great-great-great-grandmother. We can look at the genetic mistakes. We can calculate how many they are. We can essentially get a mutation rate. Overall, mutation rate's way too fast in both compartments for the evolutionists. Combined with the low variation, it really is just a fatal blow. It is every biblical creationist dream. The data we have no reason to invoke the rescue devices that they invoke. No reason, especially when you start from the Bible, you believe the Bible. What the Bible said is exactly what the scientific data corroborates. So the point is, when we're dealing with these critics, they overlook the basics because they're so focused on the rescue device. They're so focused on refuting the Bible, refuting the history as laid out in the Bible. They overlook and forget the basics. And I like how he pointed that out, that this is basic population genetics. And they know not of what they speak. Matt, how true is that? We've been dealing with these critics for years. How true is that sentence?
Oh man, I mean, they get into a debate, they don't know anything, they run to their channel and they make videos of how we were wrong about everything. It's like, well, where were these arguments in the debate? You admit you don't know anything about genetics, then you go live and refute a book on genetics. I mean, go play in the freeway. We have Parsons directly studied not only mutation rates from genealogies, by the way, he did substitution rates. You know that? He looked at the substitution rate and he said mitochondrial Eve lived 6,500 years ago. This is a secular scientist. And then we have deep-rooted pedigree studies going back, some of them 15 generations. And guess what? Selection isn't helping them. I wonder why that is. You ever notice how that's their favorite rescue device? Really, so why isn't the mutation rate clock that goes back in these deep-rooted pedigrees, how come you're not invoking those studies to say, oh, selection removed them? Oh, really? They didn't in that study. So riddle me that.
Yeah, it's not looking good for them. And here's what I find funny, okay, is we have some new old Earth creationist critics, okay, who think that they can overturn this data, that they can overturn the predictions that have been made, with many of them confirmed, even though we've already dealt with their so-called best. We've already dealt with their PhDs that are actually investing so much time, so much energy, and so much effort to deny reality and to overlook the basics. I just find it hilarious that they think they're just going to come up with something that has not already been analyzed, debunked. Okay. One thing they'll never do is present a better model. They'll try and hyper focus on one thing that they might feel like they can get a point on, while overlooking the entire bigger picture, overlooking the differentiating lines of evidence. So I just thought this was interesting. Oh yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Oh yeah, I always like to ask them, when do you think Adam lived? When do you think Noah lived? You get numbers across the board because they don't really have a model. Some might, but I mean, there's no consensus really, you know? It's just kind of like, man, you guys need to, if you're going to have a model and really hate ours, if you're going to critique ours to the point where, no, it's young Earth creation, it's completely wrong. It's like, well, what do you believe? Well, I don't know. Adam could have lived whenever. I just hold to this model. Well, man, why hate ours so much? You just admitted you don't even have one yourself. The reason you and I exist is to give believers evidence for the reason that they have their faith. We don't want people going off and being like, yeah, my parents taught me young Earth creation. Well, you know, what's your evidence? Well, I don't know. I've never really studied it. That's not a good answer. We want people to have answers because it will enhance their faith.
Right.
And so that's why we bring you the young Earth creation model, because there's so much evidence for it. I don't see much evidence for old Earth creation because the model's all over the place. I wouldn't even know where to draw the line. Like, where's the flood boundary in the old Earth theistic evolution model? Is there was no flood, I guess, and maybe it was local, maybe it wasn't, maybe it was global, maybe it was actually the time of creation. It's all over the place.
And what's funny is, as we pointed out, their very best arguments have already been dealt with. You know, it's why, Matt, you and I do this full time. We study full time. We dedicate hours and hours and hours a day to this, because we love the truth. We want to get the truth out there. We want to bring people to the truth. We want to strengthen the faith of our brothers and sisters and fellow Christians. And that's why, to everybody in the audience, you know, we're here for you, here to help you learn. We want you to have the answers, and we want you to feel confident in your faith. And it's why we do our best to pretty well answer any and all challenges and objections, really in any field, on any subject pertaining to the creation evolution debate. But one thing I want to point out is Dr. Joshua Stramidas, because he can't debate without invoking straw man arguments. He believes and has proposed that this TMR4A analysis, right here, is just, you know, the most irrefutable argument, even though he ignores everything that we've talked about: the variation, the mutation rate. He's ignored the predictions. He's ignored the history of civilization. He just goes to TMR4A. Okay. We've dealt with this in great detail in the past, but it never hurts to reiterate these arguments and how to debunk them. For anybody wondering, TMR4A stands for time to most recent 4 alleles. Okay. So we've dealt with it in the past, and I find it funny because Dr. Carter has dealt with it here in such a great way, okay? So he points out that a year or two ago, there was much discussion on the time to the most recent 4 alleles, TMR4A, on Swami Das's Peaceful Science blog. Anything but peaceful. I would call it dodgeball science blog. I've engaged there with just numerous like scientists and numerous critics, and I was shocked. I mean, I was quoting and putting forth excerpts from a lot of my books, and I've never seen such amazing dodgeball skills. And unfortunately, we only have one golden dodgeball award. They're expensive, right? I mean, these golden dodgeball trophies. So unfortunately, we could only give one to Dan. But I really felt that the entire dodgeball science blog over at Joshua Stramidas' website, I really believe that they all deserve one. So maybe they can consider that a team golden dodgeball award. So this was supposedly, it's always supposedly, right? A refutation of the biblical timeline, and at first glance appears to be a formidable argument against us. Using a program, he's got the program here, ARG Weaver, one can run models of human history that account for recombination and inheritance. Given a constant mutation rate, a constant recombination rate, a constant do you see all these assumptions that we've already spent an hour showing are just not reasonable assumptions, they're erroneous starting points? And human population of at least 10,000 individuals, how long do you think it would take for you to reach the common ancestor of most people using this method? Okay. So it continues. 500,000 years, give or take. People see numbers like that and are instantly intimidated. However, Stramidas made this admission when he set out the criteria for the calculations. Let's see his admission. In this conversation, we are not allowing for any miracles. For example, the bottleneck couple would not be specially created or be genetic mosaics with different genomes in every sperm and egg. In that same area, now we're back to Carter, he says that they were only considering bottleneck that happened 100,000 to 3 million years ago, and they never allowed the population to dip down to a single couple. That's interesting. Also, and we've pointed out in the past that they make this wrong assumption when it comes to the definition of an allele, right? When we talk about the created heterozygosity hypothesis, we're talking about millions and millions of DNA differences in chromosome pairs. And we know that there's an endless supply of diversity, right? Especially if you're defining an allele as a specific genomic location. We know there's millions of locations in the genomes, okay? Think of it like you go back to your basic genetics, right? Capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. Okay, if you're capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, you're genetically heterozygous. If you're capital A, capital A, capital B, you're genetically homogeneous. We've pointed out that it makes no sense that God would have created Adam and Eve genetically homogeneous. Makes no sense. Because when God said, be fruitful and multiply, did he want that to be carried out through cloning? Of course, it would make sense that God would have created Adam and Eve with created heterozygosity, right? Heterozygous gene sites. So capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. Now you do this throughout the genome, through millions of spots throughout the genome, then you have millions of sites with built-in diversity. And therefore, the TMR4A analysis that Stramidas puts forth, it has erroneous assumptions of the created heterozygosity hypothesis. It doesn't define allele correctly. It just has all sorts of problems. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. Hope that made sense. But let's continue here, and then Matt, we're going to hand it over to you. So, where were we? Thus, Swamidass admits to excluding all aspects of the creationist model from the get-go. I mean, that's not a very good start. How then is this a refutation of anything? About this same time, Hoster and Gouger published a paper based on their own computer model that also claimed a two-person bottleneck was possible. They did not consider young Earth models and specifically assumed the two founders evolved from a large population that evolved over millions of years. At least the claim that it is impossible that the human race started off with but two people has been falsified. Okay, this is something that's important we're getting to. And it's a technical paper we've talked about in great detail, Matt. The TMR4A calculation is an interesting intellectual exercise, but it is assuming too much in favor of the evolutionary position. They were not testing the biblical model in any sense. Instead, they were testing to how far back a single couple origin for modern humanity could be, given millions of years and a consistently large population with stable mutation rates, etc. Yet realistic biblical models were an important part of a paper. Okay, this is a paper that I've constantly put forth, especially when debating the critics. And it's an important paper to the point where you want to ask the critic, have you read this? Have you analyzed it? Because a lot of the answers to your criticisms are in this paper. These answers have been figured out. These experiments have been done. I and my colleagues presented at the last International Conference on Creationism. We're not using ARG Weaver. Instead, we were using Mendel's accountant to model the spectrum of rare and common mutations found along chromosome 22 in the 1,000 Genomes Project. We showed that several biblical models were a better fit to the real-world data than an evolutionary model, and we specifically modeled different genomes in every sperm/egg, the design gametes model. Okay, so here's the last thing I'm going to read. Regarding this graph, they complained elsewhere, not in this video, that we changed the values on the y-axis. I believe this complaint was in the peaceful, unpeaceful science blog. Y-axis between the various graphs in our paper, as if they did not understand the process of normalization. Remember, the critics oftentimes put forth arguments that demonstrates they don't understand certain aspects of the science they're trying to refute. But how can that be possible, especially if you're a PhD? No, it's because they want to straw man, misrepresent, leave things out, because they know that most of their audience are not professional scientists and they've not really studied this. So they just hope to deceive their audience, right? Hoping that they don't go look into it, hoping that they don't go look at the other side, hopefully that they don't examine it to the point where they're going to see, wow, I see why they call him Dodgeball Dan. I see why they call him Joshua Stramidas. It would have been nice to have all the world's computing power at our disposal so that we could model going from Adam and Eve to 7.5 billion people over the course of 6,000 model years, all the while tracking every mutation that happened in duplicate 3 billion letter digital genomes. We would then have had as many mutations to track as seen in the 1,000 genomes data. Barring that, the data had to be normalized to be comparable. My point is that models are always limited, ours and theirs included. Now, right here, if you look at this graph, okay, and read through the paper, you'll see, and they pointed out here, that there's a number of different biblical models that align surprisingly well with the actually observed allele frequency data. So I know that that was kind of a mouthful and that was long-winded, but Matt, as you and I always do, brother, we like to leave no stone unturned and just destroy them all, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, go ahead. I'm going to hand it over to you, brother.
No, I just agreed. I just said exactly. We want to give the audience a good, well-rounded argument. You know what I mean? It's like, hey, look, guys, there's a couple models too. So if you can even read through and be like, I just don't like that one very much, it's okay. There's multiple flood models too. Half the population are kind of divided between hydroplate theory and catastrophic plate tectonics. That's fine. There should be other models. People should try to figure out, how did the flood happen? Not if it happened. We know it did. So we've got to figure out which one best explains the data. Somebody's going to figure it out.
Amen, brother. Amen. I appreciate everybody's comments, and I appreciate it. Cat Chat, we're praying for you. I know you were saying you have a couple job interviews, so God bless you, and we're praying for success. Also, thank you for the super chat, super stickers. Matt, did you want me to play some more of the video? And next, I know you have a couple clips where we're really going to just show people that calibration is a real thing. Calibration is a fact. Yeah. Are we going to do that after the video?
Yeah, let's just go through it all. That way, if we run out of, I don't want to run out of time playing. Yeah.
All right, here we go. Let's get through more of this video. I think this is going to be another video that the channel owner, right? He'll look at this just like Simon Dan did, and he'll just say, there's no way I'm going to be able to counter that data with data of my own. So leave no stone unturned. So here we go.
Became the founders of their own genetic lineages found within the haplogroup L3. But there was still an older source population in Africa that they used to be part of. Now, we can also use changes to our mitochondrial DNA to estimate when certain lineages split off from each other. This method is known as the molecular clock, which we mentioned before. It's based on the idea that mutations occur in empty DNA at a pretty regular rate. But since that rate of change isn't the same across all of humanity, the clock needs to be calibrated.
Nope. So we're going to get into this later, but right off the bat, guys, listen closely, because I know it's going fast, 1.5 times speed. I apologize, but we do all videos like this because with how much Matt we prep and how much stuff we put into this, if we did it at normal speed, we'd never get through them. So the point is, you've already heard him talk about how he calibrates the data, which means, and we've already touched on, they can't make assumptions pertaining to the molecular clock, the evolutionary molecular clock, deep time molecular clock, because there's too many factors that they have not considered that refutes their position. We've gone over a number of them. We've gone over the differing branch lengths on these phylogenetic trees. We've gone over the fact that they pretty well ignore the fast mutation rate and commit circular reasoning. Let's assume archaeology, assume the geological column, assume the deep time, assume that there was a split between chimps and humans, and then we will come up with a molecular clock that's way slower than the clock we see today. So
and make no predictions at all, because we will get falsified immediately.
The definition of pseudoscience. And yet they want to say we're pseudoscientific. Unbelievable.
Of course.
With the help of well-dated fossils and even the DNA of ancient fossil humans. Using this method, scientists have traced the mutations in all.
Notice that. Fossils, ancient humans, things that are not inherited.
Human species. I love that one.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Even though we've spent countless hours going over the fact that what we see in the so-called hominid fossil record is significant overlap, including overlap with the Australopithecines, Homo erectus, obviously Neanderthalensis, Homo naledi. I mean, everything's been a shock to them. Everything's been a shock to them. I mean, Wise, when they found Neanderthalensis, Heidelbergensis, these other species, these islanders like Naledi, the hobbits, Luzonensis, outside of Africa, which is why they had to look to 2 out of Africa's, and just the empirical data, the diversity itself, the molecular clock itself refutes their assumptions that these so-called, differing Homo species, even though they're not different species, they're Homo sapiens. Oftentimes, a lot of them have been degenerated, unfortunately, because of the conditions, the environmental conditions, the inbreeding, the founder effect, so on and so forth. They've experienced reductive evolution, but that doesn't make them any less human. They're still made in the image of God. They have no reason to say that they're different species. But the empirical data refutes their assumptions that these different human species lived, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So it doesn't make any sense. Plus, we have Neanderthal genetics. And think about this. I want to say this, just came to mind. If what they're saying is true, there's 2 out of Africa's, okay? And we have Neanderthals that evolved outside of Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. But then Homo sapiens left, right? And they dispersed in all parts of the world, met up with Neanderthals, and yet they were still interfertile. Okay, so you'd have Homo sapiens in Africa evolving. You'd have Neanderthals evolving outside of Africa forever, how long, right? Both accumulating genetic differences, both populations becoming even more divergent from each other over time, and yet they remained interfertile. We have their genetics. We had kids with them. No, there's no logic. That doesn't make any sense. The reason why they were interfertile is because they were not separated for as long as these deep time proponents say. Neanderthals were probably founded by an early biblical patriarch. They became isolated, highly inbred, and genetically degenerative. So, I mean, everything fits the out of Babel, out of Middle East model. And maybe we should continue. There's always something we could say, right, Matt?
Yeah, I'll give you one for you real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
We have how many people are alive today? More than have ever existed. We live on every continent there is on Earth. We live in the most diverse places on Earth. Have humans ever speciated that we know of? Nothing. So why in the world would they think that it happened in the past to a small group of people? It makes no sense. I mean, you would expect to see it now, if any time, while there's more of us doing more unique things than ever before. I mean, we're training people to live on the bottom of the ocean so they can live on Mars. We're sending them up. People live in the most frigid area where they could have never lived in the past because we can get food delivered to them to live in Antarctica while they're studying core samples. So, but yet there's humans exactly the same as all of us.
Exactly. Great point. Great point. And Cat Chat makes a good point that Neanderthals, they were, I mean, 100 years ago, the Neanderthals were depicted as just some brutish half ape, half man creature. Now we know that's all been overturned. We literally have their genetics. We were interfertile with them. We mated with them. They were highly sophisticated. They buried their dead. They had purposeful navigation.
Stronger, faster, see better. I mean, you name it.
Right. Right. Exact same FOXP2 gene.
Yep.
Human in every single way. Oh, but what
Thyroid
about their
bone.
morphology? I mean, environment has such an effect now on morphology and phenotype, we know, that the Neanderthals living in this eco-glacial system, combined with the inbreeding, combined with the fact that they were superior, as you were talking about, Matt, you have superior genomes, a superior people now put into an environment that's horrible. The consequences would then be horrible. And that's why we see such a fast decline. Matt, it would be like you, who probably has nothing but, your body's probably nothing but just alkaline, right? And if suddenly you just went on the supersize me diet for a year, I mean, you're going to decline quick. Your body's not used to that, brother. Right?
I would break out after probably eating like a couple slices of pizza. I'd be kind of wrecked. Yeah, it gets real sensitive when you eat good for a while to kind of just throw everything to abandon and be like, I'm just drinking soda and eating candy. Oh, yeah, you can't do that. Kind of like can't go the other way either. Can't. You really feel the effects when you go from eating really unhealthy to really good as well. There's
right.
both
It's a
extremes.
transition, detox symptoms. So you can imagine these early biblical patriarchs that are coming out of a pre-flood world,
never eaten meat.
Yeah, right. Not used to the environmental changes, conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these populations that become isolated on islands. That's why it's so interesting that we have the same reductive evolution related features and anomalies in these islanders like Naledi, Floresiensis, which people know as the hobbits, Luzonensis. And it's like, these aren't pre-human. The reason why they're all so similar in their anomalous features is because they were all isolated people groups after Babel. Maybe some of these people groups actually spread out before Babel and became isolated. That could have been the case with Neanderthals or Erectus. So those are the consequences of those conditions. So you have these pre-flood people coming into a post-flood world and breakaway populations isolating themselves. I mean, this is exactly what we'd expect. So they'll pick up the most anomalous features, the most anomalous bones, and say, look at this, it's basal. Look at this, it's primitive. Look at this, it's pre-human. No, oftentimes it's diseased. There's pathology. It's the result of reductive evolution. It's not transitional. It's not pre-human. It's not primitive. Their arguments for human evolution are really weak.
Especially since we see that today. We can go to these islands and see pygmies. They used to throw them in zoos a long time ago. I mean, they're still there. You're restricted to your food supply. You can't grow to 6'9" on an island that's only going to supply you 600 calories in a day. That wouldn't even make sense. So natural selection is going to be like, yeah, you're staying small, buddy. I'm sorry. So,
Exactly, brother. And that's why we see a lot of these so-called hominids, pre-humans with small brains. You'll see like the Ericas of the world, right? They'll deceive the audience by lining up smaller brain to larger brain, when in fact we know all of these human variants lived at the same time. It was, if anyone's familiar with Lord of the Rings, it was like Middle Earth. We have all these people groups living together at the same time. In Lord of the Rings, you had, elves, dwarves, humans, orcs, whatever. So there was overlap. So they can't line them up in some progression. No, they all live together at the same time. Even Lee Berger, famous paleoanthropologist, has admitted that Australopithecus afarensis is probably a chimeric species, mixture of human and ape bones. Plus, we got footprints that go back right to your earliest Australopithecines. I mean, it's not good for them. So what we're actually looking at with smaller brains, with like Aractis, Floresiensis, Naledi, so on and so forth, is what happens with reductive evolution, natural selection. It's not worried about the long term. It's worried about the short term. Okay. And what we see is the fact that brains are energetically costly. So over time, especially when you have island dwarfism, what you have is shrinking brain sizes in order to preserve energy. It's survival.
Right.
It's selection. Yeah, go ahead, brother.
Yeah, and for those of you who are like, well, what about Neanderthal? I thought they were having a hard time getting food. How come their brain didn't shrink? That also comes down to natural selection. What I mean by that is, think about where Neanderthal lived. If you lived in snow and didn't have very much visibility, but you were required to have to try to find food, well, you better be able to see really good. So we know when we look at Neanderthal, their skull is larger than ours, but it's larger in a very unique area in the back, in the cerebellum. So that's what's associated with coordination. And they found that that same part of the brain that's really large in the back has to do with vision. So we actually have carvings of Neanderthal that they made for their children that have artwork that we can't even see today without a magnifying glass. So that's how good their sight was. And I believe natural selection did that for them so that they could actually live in the snow that has very low visibility. So that's why they were able to have it. And think about what meat supplies: extra ketones for the body, which supplies more energy and fuel for the body so that it can actually thrive in horrible conditions. Remember, God created humans to be able to drive. We're a great creation, opposed to what the atheists say. Oh man, we're all a mess and we have bones in our neck we shouldn't, all this stupid stuff. So we're actually an amazing design, because look at us. We really did dominate the world. And we are very, very strong. Even at the very end of our genetic entropy, right now, we're still amazing. It's crazy.
Amen, brother. Well said. Well said. So, the things that he mentioned in terms of calibration don't help him. They actually refute him. And it's kind of sad that a video like this gets millions of views and you see it being shared around, right? You see atheists all the time sharing this video around. See, this is really what the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes say, not what those young earth creationists pretend the data says. No, this video, it's erroneous. There's assumptions. It's not up to date on the science. So the calibration is not based on good data or good evidence. And one last thing I'll say when it comes to these fossils, okay, bones found in the dirt, when trying to answer the question of ancestry, or even when wanting to calibrate the data, okay, today we know that there's oftentimes more variation within the same species than between or across species. That's today. In species and variations, that we have their genetics and we can answer more things, right? But when it comes to fossils, you don't have the genetics. So it's hard to figure out what may be the result of convergent evolution, or what might just be homology, or because there exists more variation within the same species oftentimes than between, you may, based on morphology and anatomy and a bone, conclude, hey, these are different species, but really they're the same species. Or as we've seen, they've taken the same dinosaur species in different stages of its life and concluded different species, even though it's the same dinosaur species, just in different stages of its life. So you know what? It's not a good idea to look to low quality, low confidence science. And that's what we see over and over again. They're looking to. Go ahead, brother.
Oh, no. I'm good. We're ready to move on.
Let's do it, brother. Here we go.
all the major lineages of people from haplogroup L3 that appear outside of Africa. Where those non-African groups converge in time, we find the earliest humans that left Africa. And the data suggests that this happened around 70,000 years ago. And going back even further, it appears that all known haplogroups converge at a single female ancestor who lived roughly 200,000 years ago. So our mitochondrial ancestor can tell us a great deal about where we came from and when. But we also have to talk about what she can't tell us. She isn't the first woman of our species, or the first anatomically modern human, or anyone really special for that matter. For one thing, there's evidence of modern humans as far back as 300,000 years ago in northern Africa. So we know our species was around long before this woman lived, for thousands of generations. But their mtDNA just didn't make it to the present day. The fact that one woman passed on her mitochondrial genome to all of us is really just a matter of chance. Think of it this way. In any given generation, a woman might have sons but not daughters. And if she only has sons, that means none of her mitochondrial DNA will get passed on. So our mitochondrial ancestor is the only person to manage to have one or more female offspring, who in turn also had female offspring in an unbroken line for the past 200,000 years, by sheer chance. Now naturally, there are a lot of limitations to what mtDNA can tell us. The dates it provides us aren't very precise, and the genomes themselves are small, representing a tiny fraction of the information that's in our whole genome. And of course, they only tell us about half the population, females. So while mtDNA was crucial as an early source of genetic data, as sequencing methods started to improve, scientists began studying the other non-recombining stretch of DNA, the Y chromosome. And much of
Maybe we'll address some of this now, just because I know with videos like this, if you play it for too long without commentary, that's when you get copyright issues. So yeah, go ahead, brother. What are your thoughts on what he said? A lot of what he said there, we've already debunked anyways, because we've been so detailed, but yeah, anything you wanted to add to it?
Yeah, he said a lot of craziness. One was, well, we know that humans existed before the genetic evidence because we found their bones. So it's that inference, it's that assumption that that fossil record that they go by, which they say they don't need and isn't part of evolution. Yeah, well, they clearly need it, don't they? Because the genetic evidence, he confirmed himself, doesn't match what we find. So therefore, assumption time. He said a lot that was absolutely ridiculous. So I can go for a minute if you want and actually debunk all of that with basic logic. What I mean by that is, what does the genetic evidence tell us? One male, one female, low genetic diversity in the world we see today, and fast mutation rates. That can only mean one thing. Number two, there's no genetic evidence of a bottleneck outside of genetics. You just don't find the fossil record showing a worldwide bottleneck. They've actually even admitted that if you look inside the geologic column 200,000 years ago, there's nothing there. Why? Because it's not true. The fossil record is not true. So they're trying to say, without saying it, that like, well, something happened, we just don't know what it was. Oh, really? Something happened so powerful that it wiped the entire world into a bottleneck, but we don't have any evidence for it. Yeah, that makes total sense. So, number three, there's no actual genetic evidence for the story that they wield about 200,000 years ago, people living prior to the Eve that we know of genetically. They have invented a mutation rate that that doesn't even remotely match, as you guys now know. They've calibrated it to match their fossil record. So I guess and when do we ever see a bottleneck doing what they're trying to tell us? When does a bottleneck ever wipe out something and primitive man go in and modern day man come out? When does that happen to animals? Think about what happens with the cheetah. Remember when they went through their last bottleneck? That's right. They're dying. They're going extinct. They are almost gone now. That's what happens in bottlenecks. It doesn't make things better. Bottlenecks destroy genetic diversity. They wipe out the mass amount of species that exist and leave only one, and therefore whatever genetic availability that would have been in that massive variety of different species are now left over with that. Imagine if every dog died today and we were left with a Chihuahua. How many dogs could we get from the Chihuahua? Well, we sure wouldn't get the hundreds of thousands of varieties of breeds that we have today, and they sure would be a lot less than what we have in the Chihuahua. The Chihuahua would now become the wolf, the dire wolf of the old world. We wouldn't have any more genetic potential to pull out of the Chihuahua. That's what they want us to believe, is a Chihuahua went in and a wolf came out. That's nonsense. Number four, there's no logical explanation why all of the supposed 10,000 other women that were supposedly living when Eve lived, that disappeared without a trace, right? Where are the hundreds of thousands of bodies of humans that should be in the ground before this mitochondrial Eve? They're not there. If there's no evidence for these people, why believe they existed? That would be another one, right? So no evidence means it didn't happen. They can believe it happened, but they want to admit that evolution isn't faith-based. Well, okay, well, where's your evidence? Well, it's not there. Okay, it's faith-based. Number 5, let's use some basic math and logic now to figure out the truth. You see, if there is another problem, according to evolution theory, about 125,000 years ago to 200,000 years ago, there are about 10,000 women alive. Okay, 30,000 individuals estimated, and that's about, let's say 20,000 average. Okay, worldwide, by the way, worldwide. Now, let's say that half of them were women. Okay, now that's the potential average of 10,000 women are alive right now. Then a bottleneck happens, or let's even say that's 10,000 mitochondrial lines we should find in the human population. We don't find that. We don't find that anywhere. We only have one today. What are the odds? Extremely improbable, considering there should be 10,000 other women, unless they want us to believe that they only had boys. That's what the video said. He said the odds are they had males. So 10,000 women, 9,999 of them had males or no children, and one had a female. Go play in the freeway. It's getting stupider by the minute. Every time I try to even think of these things out loud, it gets stupider by the second. We're so gullible. That's why they teach kids this nonsense, is because it gets so stupid. They know an adult wouldn't believe it, and they don't portray this and to give you all the facts like this. They wield it in this little story, and then they hide everything and be like, oh, you notice how hard it was to notice that he said calibrate? Most people just breeze right over that. They don't even notice that it says it.
Right.
So here's another one.
People wouldn't even notice that. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
I want you to continue, but that's such a good point. Yeah, they don't even notice because they just sneak it in there. Well, we've got a molecular clock, and then we calibrate, and that's why the debate discussion, whatever I was having a few days ago, where the specific critic was like, I'm gonna have to look into this. Are they really making assumptions, calibrating? Yes, they admit it. It's all in their videos, and it's all in their papers. It's in their articles. Doki Doki SFT fan club, I appreciate the support. God bless you. That's awesome. So Matt, go ahead, brother. I just wanted to add that. Continue. You're killing it. This is great.
No, I was going on a tangent. Let's keep going with the video, man.
No, keep going, man. This is good. This is good. Unless that's the last point you wanted to make. It's up to you.
No, I can keep going on this. I can. This one's the most ridiculous thing of all, because they want us to just take logic and just throw it away. Don't think about the scenario about what was occurring back then, right? So what was this bottleneck? Well, they go, well, it was probably a volcano. Okay, well, a volcano would leave evidence. It would wipe humanity out. So they want us to believe that all of a sudden these primitive human beings that were so dumb, they didn't have farming, they didn't have agriculture, they didn't have math, they didn't have a writing system, they didn't leave behind any history, they didn't build any megalithic structures or have farming of any kind, they didn't have anything. And then all of a sudden they get eradicated by some volcano or some mystery comet or something like that never left any evidence. And then all of a sudden there's a huge bottleneck and only a few people come out of it. And then all of a sudden they have this magical ability to know math and writing systems and all these awesome skills, right? They just, or even funnier is, they wait 195,000 years before doing all of those things. Think about that. Think about that. Humanity worldwide did all of these things at exactly the same time. In Europe, in Asia, in Africa. All of a sudden, we just have all of those things. Oh, yeah, that's not peculiar, huh? That's not randomly. That's not strange to anybody. Oh, yeah. We just sat around on our hands, looking around at things going, yeah, that animal looks dangerous. Matter of fact, let's grunt some words out for a little while. Yeah, that means go. Yeah, right. So that makes total sense. And then all of a sudden, what's the first writing system? Yeah, that's right. It's so advanced that it's mathematical, pictorial, linguistic, all in one. And we've derived every language that we have, going from some Paleo Hebrew to Phoenician to Greek to modern day English. So we're copying the first one. So these primitive people grunting sounds to one another after not doing anything for 195,000 years just come out of nowhere, have math, have language, have a writing system, and we copy it all today. Because why? It was stupid and they were grunting it into existence, and we just decided to plagiarize this old primitive language. Yeah, that makes total sense. Language is supposed to improve. Everything would be improving over time, right? This is the evolution of different things, evolution of the writing system and language, right? Oh, really? So we're copying the primitive one in this scenario. It's going backwards. We're losing it. The people that wrote the scripture knew when something was so good mathematically, they could copy it without error based on the numerical system of the word. They could memorize it in both linguistics and mathematical. They could say, no, that's wrong. That wasn't written right because the numbers don't actually turn out to be correct. The numbers would add up perfectly in a sentence. That's mind-boggling. And so they want us to believe in the bow wow theory. Man grunted language into existence from copying the sounds of animals. Absolute nonsense. So again, they want us to ignore logic and just accept their story. Just believe this stupidity that some guy made up because he hated the Bible, by the way. I'm talking about Charles Lyell. He invented the geologic column when he was a practicing lawyer sitting in his office hating God and sitting down being like, yeah, I'm going to write that up. That makes sense. And if we push this far enough, I think we can get mankind to believe they came from an orangutan. And then he sends it off to Darwin. He's like, I think I can do that. I think I can help you with that. Really? Oh, that's peculiar, because I thought your pursuit of truth was actual science, not trying to start with this nonsensical conclusion and working backwards and looking for evidence. Everything Darwin was coming up with was wrong almost immediately. Remember this dumb little tree of life? That was eradicated when they almost immediately. They were like, oh, look, it's a branch of life. We have 3 domains. There's no single tree of life. Well, that's gone instantly, falsified, right? How fast do species form? Oh, he's like, well, my Darwin finches, they won't speciate for another 3,000 years. 3.5 years later, there's a bird. Everything he said was wrong, but we still believe the nonsense because nobody questions it. They don't teach kids to question it.
And it's just so sad that even some Christians are adopting those worthless arguments, like this too many species, or these arguments. Well, Adam and Eve really go back to 200,000 years, and you ask them why, and they have no idea why, because they're just blindly believing these types of videos. And I just find it so funny. It's like, why is the genetic data so perfectly in line with the Bible's account of human origins, right? Why do humans have such low genetic diversity? Low variation in the mitochondrial DNA, low variation in the Y chromosome. Oh, that's because we went through, 1 or 2 or 3 or who knows how many near extinction events that would have been prolonged. And because they were prolonged and due to the inbreeding, levels of heterozygosity would have been reduced. And therefore, the high levels of diversity would be shifted towards lower levels of diversity. It's like, for one, that's a rescue device. 2, the data that we have today is perfectly in line with the biblical model that says God created 2 people. That automatically restricts genetic diversity. Therefore, that's what we see today. We have no reason to invent these artificial stories. But even if you give it to them, Matt, as you were pointing out, it's a joke of a rescue device, because now you have this population of 2 to 10,000, right, that are isolated, they're inbreeding, and therefore experiencing accelerated mutational related damage, because inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. Genetic mistakes that are hidden in recessive form now come to the forefront. They're manifested. They lead to disease, degeneration, damage, okay? And unlike the biblical bottlenecks, few things. We don't explain the ultimate source of genetic variation as being the result of mutations. No, we explain the majority of genetic variation as being the result of designed variation, created nuclear heterozygosity. The evolutionists explain mutations as the source for nearly all genetic variation. So you now have this population that has accumulated mutations for millions of years. They go into this near extinction event. It's a prolonged bottleneck. So you got all these mutations coming to the forefront. We know from today what results from this kind of inbreeding, from these types of bottlenecks. Look at the cheetahs. Conservationists are worried. They're concerned. Cheetahs are now down to 7,000. Their sperm is degenerate. They've had these mutations come to the forefront. It's not good. Then they want to say that this population of 2 to 10,000, okay, highly degenerated humans with all these mutations that have accumulated are now going to just suddenly spread out into all parts of the world, seizing dominion over the planet to the point where one day they invent farming, they invent the cell phone, the laptop, they invent the space shuttle, airplanes, all because of this just amazing near extinction event. I mean, there's
It'd be
only
the same as the cheetahs doing it. It would
right.
be the same
Yeah.
thing. These
Yeah.
genetically inferior animals just spreading out. Now all of a sudden we've got cheetahs on every continent from their near death.
taking over. There's only one word that can describe their amazing storytelling. Stupid. I'm sorry if it sounds harsh, but you know what? They're pushing this nonsense, this trash, this garbage to our children. They're not based on science. It's stories being passed off as science. It's not even close to science. These stories belong in the trash. Nowhere near science.
People must know it deep down. They have to know it. And I'll tell you why they have to know it. Because when we breed an animal, we can take and see the genetic limits within it, because we don't need nature to slowly take an animal and change it. We can do it in a laboratory and on any farm. We've been breeding horses for a very long time. Why? Because there's a lot of money in it. It's called racehorsing. And racehorsing has high incentive because millions of dollars go into one horse. So we've bred horses now as much as we can. We've maxed them out on their maximum speed decades ago. We can't get them any faster. We've seen the genetic potential with horses reach their maximum. So therefore, how about dogs? You know, they're not trying to change the shape of a horse really, but they are with dogs because women want to carry them in their purse. Some guys want a hardcore pit bull when they're walking down the street. There's many different reasons people want to have a dog. So we've maxed out their genetic diversity and what we can get out of them. And every single time we have a limit we come to where we can't really get anything else. And there's just like, wow, that's it. There can be a lot of variety, just like there are in deer and there are in dogs. But guess what? That's the limit. You're looking at it. So therefore, what makes people assume that they can get it to become something else? It would become that. You don't need slow evolutionary time. You can do it in your laboratory. You can change and manipulate the genetics of anything. We do it constantly. And we can't do it with these animals. So if there wasn't a genetic limit and things could become other things over time, we could do that. We would easily have tons of evidence from laboratory experiments and watching it in nature from breeding and selective breeding, and we just don't see it. Case closed.
What do we see in the Lenski experiment? Generations after generations after generations, thousands of generations of bacteria evolving into more degenerated bacteria, because that's what we see. Things go downhill, things don't go uphill. There's no way for selection to purge the deleterious mutation accumulation. Selection, for deep time evolution to be true, okay, there has to be a way for selection to purge the damage. No, there's no way mutations and selection can increase genetic complexity, add the type of novel, meaningful information that would take a fish to fisherman. Mutation selection can explain phenotypic complexity, novel body plans, novel structures, anatomical novelty, essentially. And most importantly, selection can't purge the damage. So even if there were 1 or 10 or 50 truly beneficial mutations, truly, function increasing, complexity increasing mutations, it wouldn't even matter because they wouldn't be able to counterbalance the damage. There's no way to counterbalance the damage. George Bond says 70,000 generations, and we have bacteria that have demonstrated what? Reductive evolution. Lenski's bacterial populations have all shrank in functional genome size. They've painted themselves into a corner. They're lazy. They're handicapped. They've lost genes for short-term adaptation, sure, but it's long-term degeneration. So Anyways, let's get the rest of this. Man, time really flies by, Matt. 2.5 hours. I don't know how we could ever do a video or a response video in under an hour because
no way.
There's so much. And that's why we always say it's a great time to be a young earth creationist, because we have so much data, so much evidence. It's overwhelming. And every day, every year, it just gets better and better. And it just gets worse and worse for the critics. It gets worse and worse for the theistic evolutionists, for the old earthers, for the naturalistic evolutionists. So I think I clicked the audio, but just let me know when this goes if I did. Here we go.
This work was done in the early 2000s. And just as mtDNA can shed light on the growth and spread of certain maternal bloodlines, the Y chromosome can tell us about the migration patterns of some groups of men. For example, a pair of studies in 2010 and 2013 sequenced both the Y chromosomes and mtDNA from 2,740 people across Indonesia. And the results showed that a surprising amount of Y chromosome DNA came from far away, like China, India, Arabia, and even Europe, especially in Indonesia's western islands. On the island of Borneo, for
What's funny, I'll add this. We have Y chromosomes that are geographically specific. Chinese Y chromosomes, African Y chromosomes, European Y chromosomes, you name it. Okay. And yet still, every single male Y chromosome is pretty well the same. That's why we can take every single male Y chromosome, build a family tree, and see, wow, we all come from one single Y chromosomal ancestor. But the fact that these Y chromosomes, a lot of them are geographically specific, and yet none are really all that much divergent from the rest. This points us right back to Babel, the Tower of Babel. That's what happened, is you had all these people groups, all these male lineages going to different parts of the earth, and therefore being separated from each other, accumulating their own mutations in their own lines. And we see evidence of that. The frequencies of alleles we see globally, including the Y chromosomes, scream Babel. Scream the biblical model. This guy can't show you any data. He can assert, but he can't show you any data that says the Y chromosome goes back any more than a few thousand years, 4,500, 500, 5,000 years. He can't. He can say it, but he can't.
For instance, the presence of the Y haplogroup known as OM7 seems to be the fingerprint of immigration of men from Han Dynasty China about 2,000 years ago. But in those same men, their mitochondrial DNA more closely resembled local haplogroups. So that suggests that, at least over the past few thousand years, men have been arriving from elsewhere and pairing up with local women. And when it comes to how far back this Y chromosome goes, the latest molecular clock calibrations now suggest that our Y chromosomal ancestor lived about 200.
Notice, he didn't talk about empirical data. He didn't talk about, the observed mutation rate. The fact that the Y chromosome is fast. The Y chromosome mutates about one mutation per generation. Okay, the mitochondrial DNA is fast as well. When we account for purifying selection, when we visualize worldwide Y chromosome diversity and mitochondrial DNA diversity in these phylogenies or phylogenetic trees, no. We don't have a Y chromosome ancestor and a mitochondrial DNA ancestor that go back to 200 to 300,000 years. No, the only way you can get that is through calibration. And he just admitted it for like the 5th time. Okay. Calibration is not science. It's circular. You're assuming your history. You're assuming evolution. You're assuming archaeology. You're assuming geology. And that's why they come up with a mutation rate that's just so much slower than the observed mutation rate.
100,000 to 300,000 years ago. Much like with our mitochondrial ancestor, this guy must have had at least one male offspring, who in turn had more males in an unbroken line for hundreds of millennia. And we don't really understand why these two individuals left the indelible mark that they have in our genomes. One idea is that there might have been a boom in the human population around 200,000 years ago in Africa, when our species happened to be doing very well for itself. If that were the case, then the offspring of both of those people may just have been more likely to survive and pass on their DNA. Or in the case of our Y chromosome ancestor, it could be that he had a sort of Genghis Khan thing going on, having many.
It's a lot of guessing. They don't know. Because remember, they disregard the Bible as being true. The Bible tells us it's the history book of the universe. They reject that. They reject its claims in terms of human history. And therefore, as you can see here, there's a lot of guesswork, a lot of assumptions, maybe this, maybe that. No, the reason why we have this data is because the Bible's true. Adam's the first man. Eve's the mother of all living, and our last Y chromosomal ancestor is Noah, because 8 people came off of the ark during a massive bottleneck 4,500 years ago. That's what the genetics corroborates, but they assume that away.
many kids, some of whom were sons who also went on to have many kids. But the story that these two people can tell us ends when they were born, because we can't trace their genetic trail any further back in time. So to probe the origins of anatomically modern humans, we need earlier sources of data. Remember, the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial genome represent just a small fragment of the human genome. So
Exactly. Cat Chat makes a good point. We don't know a thing. Maybe this, maybe that. Guess. Assumption. You know what? Pick up your Bible, read the Bible, especially Genesis, and you'll have your answers. And you'll see, wow, that's why the data is the way it is.
to understand the whole range of human diversity, we need to study the whole range of human diversity. Luckily, this is the 21st century, and we no longer have to sequence tiny stretches of individual genomes by hand. We can sequence whole genomes, and quickly. So as our technology and methods improve, we may soon be able to reach beyond the lives of these two ancestors into the even deeper past. But even when we do, each of us will continue to carry the molecular legacy of one man and one woman who managed to make their mark on all of humanity.
I like that. Maybe one day we'll be able to go past them, really, because no one's done it so far.
Right.
And that's the other thing too, is the Dr. Jeanson actually found the fast mutation rate hidden inside of another mutation rate study that came to different conclusions. He found it in the supplemental work, meaning they looked at the chain, the branches of the Y chromosome, and found that the rate was extremely fast and said, we have to select other features. So you're dealing, when you go online and you look up my Y chromosome mutation rate, you don't find the fast rate. Why? Because they'll lose their government grant money. They don't want to not prove what they got paid to prove.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And you see them admit it, right? One Y chromosomal ancestor, one mitochondrial DNA ancestor, and yet no evidence provided, empirical evidence, that there were hundreds of thousands of years worth of prior ancestors. That's not what the data says. They don't have the data for that. Yeah, what other thoughts did you have on that portion, brother?
On that portion, well, luckily I made a video, and that's where my notes are.
Good,
I've been
good.
going on tangents this whole time. I didn't even have my notes. So,
Well, I think it's a good time to go to those couple videos that we have, just to really show it's any at this point, any critic, I don't care who you are, if you still want to say that their dates and their story is all based on calibration and assumptions, then you're not interested in truth. Okay. Because this video proved just that. We like the empirical method, they like the assumption-based method. You want to play those videos, Matt?
sure. Yeah, here, let me share screen. You can
Thanks, Doki Doki. I appreciate that. Oh yeah, here we go, brother.
Hypothesis.
all right. So this is the same video, except for I pause it after particular statements are made, and I show a visual. And the visual is to give me, remind me of something I wanted to talk about. So I'm sure it'll spark you as well. So here we go.
The hypothesis that modern humans originated in Africa and spread throughout the world. This model was first developed by anthropologists around the 1980s, based on skeletal evidence. Now, we can also use changes to our mitochondrial DNA to estimate when certain lineages split off from each other. This method is known as the molecular clock, which we've mentioned before. It's based on the idea that mutations occur in empty DNA at a pretty regular rate. But since that rate of change isn't the same across all of humanity, the clock needs to be calibrated. The clock needs to be calibrated.
So this is what we talked about earlier. It's a calibration method based off the fossil record, and I put up 3 different studies to show how they calibrate it and why they calibrate it, so that you guys can see for your own eyes. This isn't a mystery. They don't hide it. They just infer it. They believe it's true so much they don't even see a problem with doing it. That's when you know something's wrong. You know, when you're talking to a guy that's a thief and they're like, oh, it's okay, I won't get caught next time. It's like, next time you shouldn't have done it the first time, man. So these people are so out of their minds that they literally don't see a problem with calibrating something. It's like, oh, it's okay to just change data because it doesn't fit? Oh, of course it is. Oh, I didn't know that. Why? Oh, because evolution is true. Oh, I didn't know that we weren't allowed another opinion. And to them, you're not. You can't go to class and write down a different answer. You'll fail. What happens if you bring a different concept? Well, guess what? It's not allowed. Evolution is protected by law. If something's protected by law and doesn't allow it to be falsified or replaced, it's not science. But let's move on, unless you want to say something there.
No, you're good, brother. Keep going.
All right. All right, I made this for you, by the way. Here's the observed rates with non-assumption. I'm sorry, here's the assumption rates that are used for human and chimp ancestry. So when we look, we can see in 1991, they got about 166,000 plus or minus 55,000 years. 1992, 130,000 years to 137,000. You can see, and then we go all the way down to the bottom, we see a range of 72,000 years minimum up to 300,000 years. That's a difference of 288 or 228,000 years. That's with their assumption method. How in the world can you be so far off in your assumption method when you're making things up? See how big of a window they want so they can never be wrong? You can just throw out anything. They might as well have said 1 to 900,000. Means the same thing. If you're not going to have any accuracy at all, you might as well not even attempt. So here's what we actually see. We see the observed rate on the upper left-hand corner, and then the estimated rates down at the bottom right with that huge, massive bar trying to grasp reality. In the middle, nothing. So we see the observed rate, which is, one substitution every 800 years, and or 1 in 1,600 years at the maximum. And then way down here is what they say is the reality, is 1 mutation every 19,000 years. So off by an order of magnitude. So there's reality and then there's myth. So you pick what side you want to believe. And here's them admitting that pedigree rate studies are much better. It says it is clear that pedigree rate studies provide a direct estimate of the mutation rate. Direct estimate. So no guessing needed.
Our mitochondrial ancestor can tell us a great deal about where we came from and when. But we also have to talk about what she can't tell us. She isn't the first woman of our species. Or the first anatomically modern human, or anyone really special for that matter.
Uh-huh. And this picture here is Dr. Jensen, and you can see in the bottom left, it's kind of hindered. The little art is not his, but he shows the difference between what we actually see with differences between chimpanzees and what their mutations actually are. And again, evolution fails miserably with what we actually see in reality. I think if I hit play, you can see it for like a second. It's just going to vanish because I only made I only made pictures just as reminders. Something you can go back to and look at later. It's also in our work, in our books that we like to promote. We like Dr. Jensen's work a lot. We think that he has probably one of the best models that are out there. And he has shown that if evolution were true, how many mutations would there be as the differences between humans and chimpanzees? How many mutations would they have inside of chimpanzees, and how many would humans have? So he's run all these numbers, and they're all in favor of young Earth creation using the observed rates. So we'll move on.
Mitochondrial genome to all of us is really just a matter of chance. Think of it this way. In any given generation, a woman might have sons but not daughters. And if she only has sons, that means none of her mitochondrial DNA will get passed on.
That's what I was telling you earlier about when they made a statement in the video about maybe all the other women that were alive only had male children. Well, when you think about that, how many do they actually believe existed at the time? That's right, 9,999 other women. So let that sink in.
So our mitochondrial ancestor is the only person who managed to have one or more female offspring, who in turn also had female offspring in an unbroken line for the past 200,000 years, by sheer chance.
I love it. Sheer chance, everyone. That's right. Sheer
I'm telling you, reviewing these videos, looking at their logic, their reasoning, it's the best comedy. It really is. And that's the thing. Not a lot of people, I bet, out of the millions that watch this video have noticed these things, right?
No.
Which really is a shame. And now you can't miss it. Anyways, keep going, brother. This is great.
Yeah. We like to point out these things because you're never going to hear this in school. If you're going to school right now, you're going to go and you're never going to hear these things. They're going to hide that as much as they can. And but this is the reality. If you look on the left, you see a massive population. Then you see what would be like maybe the 200,000 year bottleneck. Maybe it was a volcano of some sort. Then you have a small population going, and then you have another volcano, maybe say the Catawba catastrophe. But you have in between all these bottlenecks small populations of people. Well, how can you keep having small populations of people that are inbreeding over vast amounts of time and not have a lot of mutations reaching fixation and not having mutations killing people over periods of time? That scenario doesn't work out. So when they say you creationists have an inbreeding problem, they don't know what they're talking about, because our bottlenecks only last a single generation, and then there's a massive explosion in populations of people. They have a problem because they have multiple bottlenecks with only small groups and factions of people living in small groups over tens of thousands of years. Sorry, evolutionist, you're living in a reality that is in a world all of its own, and it's called fantasy land. That's why we call it SpongeBob imagination. You can't look at something like this and think that that's logical. You know it's not logical, and you know it's wrong, and your theory promotes this nonsense. So,
well, that's why, and I've had so many debates with these guys where they constantly say, well, the reason why there's low variation is because there's been extinction events, bottlenecks, and yet we're pointing out that that's ad hoc, it's a rescue device, it's storytelling, it's artificial. But for sake of argument, even if we were to grant you that, those bottlenecks are destructive, they're disastrous. They don't explain the data, they actually just raise more problems. So I'm glad you pointed that out, brother.
yeah, and where's the evidence of all these bottlenecks with people in between them? You mean to tell me that there's been millions of years with people that are primitive, that have been burying the dead and living in these groups of people, and we'll find a couple bones here and there? Come on, get out of here, nonsense. That's our model right there.
Now, there are a lot of limitations to what mtDNA can tell us. The dates it provides us aren't very precise, and the genomes themselves are small, representing a tiny fraction of the information that's in our whole genome. And of course, they only tell us about half the population, females. So while mtDNA was crucial as an early source of genetic data, as sequencing methods started to improve, scientists began studying the other non-recombining stretch of DNA, the Y chromosome. And much of this work was done in the early 2000s. And when it comes to how far back this Y chromosome goes, the latest molecular clock calibrations now suggest that our Y chromosomal ancestor lived about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago.
They can't help themselves.
No, they can't.
They just can't. They don't even see it. They don't even see it. It's embarrassing. So this chart is Dr. Jensen's. This is the Y chromosome mutation rate that he deemed from a study looking at Europeans. No other people group, not Africans, not Asians. This is a European only. And the chart on the left shows the mid-range, with the black line here in the middle being the upper range and the lower, and then the actual evolutionary route on the right. So pretty incredible that we are able to deem when Noah actually lived based on that. So here's why we use the Y chromosome. We only observe about 4,500 years of mutation accumulation in the paternal ancestry contained in the record of the human Y chromosome. Incredible.
And remember, the initial studies that they did, I believe the main ones were one in 2009, one in 2015, Matt. And as we've pointed out before, is they were based on very low quality data and low quality DNA. And that's where they got results that they concluded were verification that, Adam, Y chromosome Adam, was hundreds of thousands of years ago. But two additional studies, one in 2015, another one in 2017, that were based on more high quality DNA. And the studies that Jensen put out recently, they looked at the details, right, Matt, in the supplemental material.
That's right.
Right. and they found that the number of father to son Y chromosomal differences were approximately 10-fold higher. And Jensen explains that they discovered something rather unexpected, which they actually admit, and even admit that the empirical findings prompted them to explore additional filters.
meaning they saw that and ran and calibrated.
Right?
Yeah, it's calibration time, guys.
They took their high quality DNA results and filtered stuff out that doesn't fit with their evolutionary or deep time scale. So
it's what Dan would do if he was working on the study.
Right. So when we actually looked at high quality DNA, okay, it's perfectly consistent with a last Y chromosomal ancestor, actually, because the mutation rate's so high, a last Y chromosomal ancestor of just 4,500 years ago. And Jensen points out that there are, I think, 8 to 59 times the amount of mutations that we currently observe in Y chromosome DNA sequence. So it's just fascinating that it goes right back to 4,500 years ago. And because of this data, he has been able to confirm many of his predictions in terms of the history of civilization. So it turns out that the Y chromosome is one of our greatest lines of evidence.
Yeah, it is. And I'm about to shock everybody with what you're going to see next. So what you're looking at here is what Dr. Jensen discovered by looking at the multiple different studies. As you can see, there's an average mutation rate of about 3 per generation with a high of about 5 over here. So Jensen said, okay, if there's 3 mutations per generation, this is going to be very easy to count. Now, what do we know about our model? Well, I showed you a picture here, which you can see, which is what we predict. And that off the arc, there were a certain amount of generations until Peleg. And then there's a dispersion of people. But guess what? The Bible tells us how many generations there were till Peleg. There were 6 of them. So now, can we use a mutation rate telling us of the number 3 and make a prediction based off what the account actually says? We can. And guess what? We know that Peleg, I should say Peleg would have around 16 mutations, 16 to 18 mutations, because of the 6th generation out. He would have that many. Well, guess what? We found that haplogroup that exploded and became haplogroup Q and R, S, K, M, N, O, T, and L all came from that 6th generation, which had 16 mutations. So how incredible is that? Literal genetic evidence of the mutation rate that we see in the Y chromosome today, 6 generations later, explains Japheth and Shem's ancestry. Exactly what we see.
It's why we always say genetics, the direct line of evidence, the best way to answer the question of ancestry, has confirmed the Bible.
Exactly. This new data just completely crumbles because it keeps matching what we read in scripture. This doesn't have to add up. It could be off by literally 3 numbers and we're in trouble, right? It just kind of throws a wrench in. Now we have to try to explain, like, well, why is this missing? Why is there more mutations? Why is there less mutations? We don't have to worry about that because it's matching up. It would be one thing if Peleg wasn't in Shem's line and it was in Ham's line, and we've never tested Ham's line and we just kind of like have an arbitrary number to go by. But this is what we see. Completely shocking. But let's move on.
If I could add one thing before you continue, is we've discussed at great length these kinds of topics, right? We've written numerous books on it. And months ago, maybe even a year ago now, I'm not even sure. Time flies by. We've battled it out with a lot of critics. We've done a lot of videos. The Y chromosome data and the resulting predictions are so powerful, but there's been no successful rebuttal, I should say. But Gutsa Gibbon had Joshua Stramidas on her channel, for an interview where he gave the worst, just the absolute most horrible so-called rebuttal to the Y chromosome data, including Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's recent papers. And it was so bad that we did full-length rebuttals. Okay. But because our full-length rebuttals were oftentimes 2 to 3 hours, we also put out a series of 10-minute videos. So I'm going to put in the chat, especially for the old earthers, some of these old earthers, these low-hanging fruits that now want to try to do what nobody else has been able to do and debunk this model of ancestry. Please do not repeat arguments that have already been debunked and think we're going to take the time to respond. So the point is, I'm going to put a video in the chat right now for people afterwards. Maybe save it. It's a 10-minute video where we refute Joshua Stramidas, his just worthless arguments on Y chromosome pedigrees. And what's funny is Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal, he attempted to refute this 10-minute video, and he was so confident. He said, I'm going to do a blind rebuttal. And it was the worst mistake of his life. You could see it in his face when he was doing it. He didn't address anything. You could tell he was regretting a blind rebuttal real quick. He failed miserably. So I did a follow-up a couple days later titled, like, just, you know, the funniest or just the greatest rebuttal to a blind rebuttal of all time or something. And I just demolished that. So the point that I'm trying to make, guys, is this evidence is very powerful, incredibly powerful. And the very best, most prominent critics, the ones that spend the most time trying to debunk young Earth creation, they've all failed. So this is very powerful, and we've also addressed the top challenges. So Matt, as you continue, brother, I'm going to post this 10-minute video that has never gone addressed. The critics have dodged, and it really says a lot. I mean, I think they know they're cornered. So brother, you continue, and I'm going to put the link in the chat.
All right, here we go.
Now, we don't really understand why these two individuals left the indelible mark that they have in our genomes. But even when we do, each of us will continue to carry their molecular legacy.
Yeah, I bet they don't know what that's kind of storytelling.
One man and one woman who managed to make their mark on all of humanity. One of the most important things we've learned about ourselves from mitochondrial DNA is the story of human migration. Even though it's passed on from mother to child without recombining, mtDNA does slowly accumulate mutations.
So here's The Crumbling Genome. It's a book written by Kondrashov, who tried to figure this out, and he never did. He came up with some ideas and some theories, but really just was like, I think whoever figures it out will probably get a Nobel Prize. No YouTube atheist has yet to get one, but our hopes are still high because they talk a big game. So we'll see. It's the book is called Why We're Not Dead 100 Times Over. You can read this. You can read it yourself. Kind of expensive, really, on Amazon, but I'm sure you can find it floating around the internet somewhere. But we will go on. This is kind of my diagram, which is called the design diversity. Is you're looking at the mitochondria down here, and you're looking at the nuclear DNA, the designed built-in, and then down here, what would be looking at as mutations accumulating in the mitochondria that come from damage and come from new mutations over generations that get inherited. So we're going to look at a couple other pictures did with animals, and we can. I used the analogy of a battery for the mitochondria because the battery might be different in lions than it is in humans, and because, you know, that's what the evolutionist would see as common ancestry. They'd be like, well, look at the battery size and look at the shape. It matches these animals more, so they must be related. But in reality, you would expect the engine of a car to be similar in cars than it would be in a plane. So clearly the mitochondria might resemble something more, but that's because of design diversity based on function. So when we're looking at mitochondria, what really separates it are the mutations that are accumulating. So this next picture really is going to explain it the best. Something got off the ark like a cat, and it diversified. and it speciated and became the different cats that we see in the world today. But yet cats have different mutation rates. So how do we determine what cat was on the ark if each of them have a different clock going on? So Standing for Truth and I did a study on that. It's called the invalidation of the neutral theory and falsifying the molecular clock, basically saying that we use the observable rates and we use it to predict the mutation rate in cats and humans and all life, but we also use these same molecular clocks to determine what animal species was on the ark. But we also did it with genome size, and we also did it with chromosome loss over time. We're reversing backwards to a state where something would have the most genetic potential inside of it, and then it loses itself over time. So if you picture the door in the back as a bottleneck, everything had to go through that door. That is Noah's Ark. Okay, here's the bottleneck, the mitochondria reset button. So if we see a human, a chimp, a gorilla, and an orangutan, which one of these are older? Well, if you believe in evolution, we would say, well, the orangutan is older because it has more mutations in it. But I thought they all came through that door at the same time. Yes, they did. That's what the genetic evidence tells us. All of these things independently walked through that genetic bottleneck at exactly the same time, and there are genetic boundaries. So why does the orangutan have more mutations in it? I don't understand. How come they have more than humans? I thought they were older. No, they're not older because of this reason right here. And what you're looking at is, of course, the red bar is over it. That's wonderful. Luckily, I've memorized it. Is the orangutan on the left has a generation time of 11 years. The gorilla has one of about 20 years. The chimp has 20 years, and a human has around 29 or 30 years. So if you're looking at an orangutan that has an 11-year generation time, it literally has double the amount of generations that a gorilla has. Well, guess what? When you look at an evolutionary phylogenetic chart, the orangutan, they say, has existed twice as long as a gorilla. But how? Now we know that they all came through the genetic bottleneck at exactly the same time. So it's absolutely impossible for the orangutan to be older than the gorilla, yet they still say that it is. So again, they are completely wrong. The genetic evidence now completely falsifies them, and it falsifies neutral theory, because neutral theory poses that all of these would mutate at exactly the same rate. And we know now they do not. And one of the main reasons for that would be generation time and accumulation of mutations.
Matt,
yes,
what would you recommend? We've got someone in the chat saying, is there any book on the thing that Matt Mann is saying? So we've got many books on this topic. Which book would you recommend for anybody who really, really wants to dig deep on what you were talking about?
This one in particular, I would recommend that you read our study on our website. You can link that to them. It's our invalidation of neutral theory, and it's found for free on the website. I know it's on Creationist Clothing under articles, and it's probably on the Standing for Truth website as well. You can directly go down and see our study and read where we make predictions on this, and on how we make predictions and why. And that covers exactly what I'm stating right now. If you want books on it, there would be two. The first one that Standing for Truth held up with the blue cover would be a really good one, and also the Young Earth Creation Model. Those two really specifically hyper-focus on the genetic diversity of mankind.
And in this one, Independent Origins Handbook, the last chapter, I should say appendix, touches on kind of the basics of what you were just explaining. It's titled Created Heterozygosity Model Explained, where I'm at.
Perfect.
So you go over that model in a way that is understandable to the layperson. So that's certainly there's a few books you could definitely pick up there. I'm going, Matt, as you continue talking, I'm going to go grab our study
Great.
from our website and post it in the chat. So go ahead, brother.
Sure. All right. So what I was describing earlier, showing you that they believe that the orangutan is older than the gorilla, that's older than the chimpanzee, based on mutations that are inside of these creatures, they build this chart. And this chart, again, shows you that the first to arise was the orangutan, and then there's a branch off between the gorilla that came next, and then the chimpanzee, and then hominids, the split, right? But now you guys can see, obviously, with a genetic bottleneck that we all now completely agree with, by the way, evolutionists as well, they can't deny it anymore. The genetic bottleneck was worldwide, mitochondrial reset, and genetics and mutations started accumulating in all of them at exactly the same time when they came off the ark or they came off the evolutionary bottleneck. It doesn't matter which one you want to believe. They all went through the bottleneck and came out of it at exactly the same time. So why in the world would they still draw these phylogenetic charts when they know it's wrong? That's the real question to ask. Now, what do we see? We see genetic boundaries as well. And yes, they admit that. And here is a drawing that, again, we've made. This is a custom image of the arc on the left. And then what happens with mutation accumulation over time. This is the minimum amount of genetic mutations in human beings that you can see down here to the left, which is around like 0.1 and up to about 10. And then what do we see in chimpanzees? Well, it's really, really high with a genetic average around 65 mutations for them. But humans are down around 10. And then gorillas average about 75. And then the orangutan goes all the way up to about 100. And then what do we see? Well, we're going to move on, and then we're going to see how to describe these things. Well, here's the physical way to do it. These are called holobaramins. And these are something that were created. These are created kinds. And this is done by taking physiological differences. And somebody has done this for us. And they lined up Homo erectus, Neanderthal, and Homo sapiens. And guess what? Everything conformed into a nice, tight holobaramin, which were separate created kinds. Look at this. Chimpanzees, all a created kind. Gorillas branched together, and orangutan. So God created one of each of these different kinds. Very, very simple. And this is from physical differences, not genetic differences. That's what baraminology focuses on. But that's a whole nother story. We'll get into that another time. Here's an image that Standing for Truth was talking about earlier. Go ahead.
I was going to real quick, because that's a great point. Just really, really quick. When it comes to baraminology and answering this question of ancestry, separate ancestry versus universal ancestry, it's the young earth creationists that are doing the best work, as you pointed out there, brother, where we can do the, statistical baraminology. We can also do baraminology in terms of genetics. And similar to what you presented there, you've got people like Aaron Ra that put forth this silly phylogeny challenge, right? We've already confirmed separate ancestry. We've already been able to separate humans from every other form of life, from any other form of life. And when we look at the genetic data, when we look at the statistical data, what we find is Homo sapiens, specially created, obviously Adam and Eve, Adam the first man, Eve the mother of all living. And when we look at the fossil humans, we can easily determine what is and what isn't part of that baramin. Here, just a second, brother. I'm going to mute you just for 1 second as you do that. So we've got Homo sapiens here. And as we were explaining earlier for a while, after the Tower of Babel, you have subpopulations that branch off. Some maybe even before Babel, where you then have isolation, inbreeding, mutation accumulation, recessive mutations coming to the forefront. What this leads to is pathology, disease, reductive evolution, anomalous features. So these subpopulations unfortunately went extinct. Neanderthalensis, erectus, naledi, floresiensis, denisovans, where we have living humans today. Okay, humans completely separate from any other form of life. And we're also able to determine which apes are related to which using genetics, the most direct way, as well as, to the best of our ability, statistical baraminology. So whenever these evolutionists try and say or propose this ancestry challenge or a type of phylogeny challenge, it's important to point out that we've already determined that separate ancestry best fits reality. And this is all based on many lines of evidence, but most importantly, the direct lines of evidence. I just wanted to point that out, Matt. So let me share your screen again, brother, and you're good to go whenever you're ready. Oh, if you're still, Matt, did you step away for a minute? Let me see. Matt might have stepped away for a minute, so we'll wait for Matt to come back. Let me thank everybody in the chat. As always, these streams really fly by. They're so much fun. We're already going on 3 hours, so this is another important stream to share. Get out there. The video we're critiquing tonight's got millions of views, and therefore we want as many people as possible to see that the information being presented in that video is not based on empirical data, and it's also based on a lot of assumptions. Matt, go ahead, brother. I see that you're back.
Okay, we didn't need to keep going. I just am, because these are all just notes. But
no worries. Yeah,
let me know when you want
unturned. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I created this chart actually for you. This will be in one of your books coming up. All of the top are all of these so-called missing links from everything from Neanderthal, Denisovan, modern day Homo sapien, Cro-Magnon. You can go down the list. And then at the bottom are all the ones that they want to say are our ancestors. But I separated them out, and look at how clearly obvious it is when we're dealing with these things. The physiology is just vastly, vastly different.
All the strange words make sense.
Boom. Just so simple. Here's the Eve's mitochondrial consensus sequence that Dr. John Sanford has. So yes, we actually have Eve's sequence. You like that one. The design diversity allele difference. One of my favorite studies of all you can find online is the one that I keep talking about right now, where 90% of all life arose at exactly the same time. It's pretty obvious what that means. There was a worldwide global flood. 10% of life survived. The other 90% died. And then all life today arose from it. 90% of everything we see came from 10%. That's what that's telling us. Here's the study. All humans descended from the same man and woman. Genetic study reveals 90% of the life has debunked much about what we knew about the world of evolution and species.
If I could real quick, Truth Defenders, good to see you here, brother. He asks, I read Bones of Contention a long time ago. That's a great book. I've actually got it back here, Bones of Contention. And the source that I was showing earlier is from Contested Bones. So this one's a newer, more up-to-date book by Christopher Roop and Dr. John Sanford, author of Genetic Entropy. Why I recommend both books. This one's amazing because it's up to date in terms of all the latest findings, like Australopithecus sediba, Homo habilis. It goes into the hobbits, and it also goes into the evidence that suggests a lot of these claimed pre-humans, transitional species. They're not they're not primitive, they're not basal. They're actually the result of accelerated genetic degeneration, because you have small people groups isolating, mostly after Babel, possibly before. And that's what happens in isolation, is you get inbreeding, genetic pathology, and disease. So good question. I highly recommend that. I have a book as well, Why Human Evolution is False, that touches on a lot of those things as well. So which you can see in the Creationist Clothing store on the website, standingfortruthministries.com. Click the shop button. It'll take you to some of our books. And I highly recommend Contested Bones as well. So Truth Defender says, cool, I'll check it out. No problem. Anyways, go ahead, Matt. These are good. This is some great data. One thing I want to point out, notice how as young earth creationists, we present the data, provide technical papers, provide predictions, and so much information, where some critics, I mean, it's really just a lot of rhetoric, a lot of posturing, but not a lot of argumentation, not a lot of data-filled responses, I've noticed. So anyways, keep it up, brother. Go ahead.
Yeah, a lot of people like to say, like, I don't understand how you can read these papers and come to the conclusion that it says young Earth creation. They clearly state that it's evolution oriented. It's like, wait a minute, you can't think for yourself? You mean to tell me that they've come to the conclusion that evolution is true because their grant funding says they better find evolution being true? They make these studies and they have a conclusion that needs to be met. And we can easily read between the lines. You know, you should be able to question any study of all. It's very, very simple. They've done the heavy lifting, and we've come in and said, look at this. I can't believe they came to the conclusion that evolution is true, even after they directly admit that they've debunked what they thought evolution even says. And then we point it out, and they said, they get all mad. Well, of course we're going to point it out. You know, that's what we should do. It doesn't even make any sense. So anyway, we're going to move on right now, but because we're getting near the end, if you have questions about anything, leave your questions. We'll answer them. Here we go. This is the same study, by the way. Here's where they admit that there's no trace in the geological record of any global event in the last 200,000 years. So here they're saying that whatever the event was that slashed the population down to almost nothing can't be found. There's no evidence for it. So they just want us to believe that a mythical event eradicated all life in the oceans and on land and didn't leave a trace. Thank you. Here it is again. Absence of in-between species is something that perplexed Darwin. Here's yet another example of genetic boundaries right here. Unexpected finding from the study, species have clear genetic boundaries. Why? What are genetic boundaries? They're boundaries that exist from mutation rates. We look at mutation rates and go, what is the mutation accumulation going back to the bottleneck? What we do is we look over and we see that there was a species like a human being that has just a few mutations in them. Well, they go, well, wow, that's weird. Human beings haven't existed for a very long time, so they must have come out of the bottleneck. That's why they tell everybody, yeah, primitive man must have went in, because we can't find modern day man, you know, so therefore a primitive one must have went in and modern day man came out. They can't think for themselves, right? Evolution blinds them. Here we go. The conclusion was very surprising, and I fought against it as hard as I could. See how they had to fight against the very clear, genetic, obvious answer to things? We don't have to fight against anything. I really like this image, by the way. This image was, I believe, made just from the look of it by a guy, something Smith. Trey Smith, I believe, is the name. He's old school now. I don't even know if he makes content anymore, but he sure made some good images, and this is a great one. It's Charles Lyell admitting if he pushed this as far as he can go, he would prove that man came from orangutan. This is before there was ever even any evidence for anything, by the way. No evidence at all. He just made it up and said, if we continue to push this nonsense that I invented, we can convince the stupid public who will believe anything if you tell them, and then they'll believe that they came from an orangutan. And guess what people believe today? Shocking. And why did he do it? In his own words, to free the sciences of Moses. He had a clear biased intention, not science. It was nothing. And that's it.
That's epic. That's epic. That's a lot. That's a lot of information. Godzilla Freak made a point earlier that this channel, PBS Eon, are probably not used to these types of detailed rebuttals. So it may be a rude awakening, but the point is, we've shown why the genetic data, the direct lines of evidence, really the direct way of determining and answering this important question, corroborates perfectly with the biblical record, the biblical model of ancestry. There's a couple of things here just to leave really no stone unturned. He very frequently made the point that they can, hopefully I didn't lose the slide here now. right around here, very frequently made the point that they know, or that they expected these sequences, right? The Eve consensus sequence, the Y chromosome consensus sequence. We did deal with that. I just wanted to deal with it in a little bit more detail, since they really, really do like to repeat this. And I've got an excerpt here that I think explains it perfectly. Some have argued that a consensus Eve sequence is expected to arise by chance, even if there was no literal Eve, based upon what is called coalescence theory. So we talked about earlier how that has many assumptions, random mating being one of them, and coalescence theory essentially was invoked in order to explain the data, explain away the data that actually confirms biblical creation. Trying to use coalescence theory to explain why all humans came from a single woman who was not Eve, but was a member of a large population. Remember, they try and say that? He said that a couple times. Requires many unrealistic assumptions. Most importantly, global coalescence requires maintenance through deep time of a single unified breeding population with a perfectly random mating. Remember, we talked about that earlier? The coalescence calculation fails when given biologically realistic conditions where there are isolated subpopulations, in brackets, tribes. The reality is that historically, people have always spread out, distanced themselves from competing populations, sorted themselves into tribes, and preferentially mated within local populations. Obviously, people in Australia in ancient times were not normally mating with people in Africa. This means evolutionary coalescence cannot realistically be applied globally in terms of early mankind. In early human history, isolated tribes clearly diverged from each other, producing race-like differences, which would have resulted in the preservation of whatever mitochondrial diversity might have been present in the beginning. This is important, guys. It is actually very unreasonable to expect a clear evolutionary Eve sequence, given what we know about human reproduction. And it's also very similar to the Y chromosome Adam, who they coined. But realistically, it's Y chromosome Noah. It's very unreasonable from a deep time perspective to expect the data that we actually have. And as we point out, all we have to do is visualize this data, the mitochondrial DNA variation, the Y chromosome, in terms of a phylogeny. Critics like to say, oh, that's not rooted. What's nice about the unrooted representation is that it allows a natural reading of the data, and exactly what we see is exactly what we expect. Okay, we know the mutation rate's fast. There are not tens of thousands of mutations here. Explosive growth from a center point. One woman, Y chromosome, one man. Okay, low variation in both DNA compartments. 200-300 generations max. Goes right back to the first couple. Okay, Adam and Eve, Y chromosome. We would have Y chromosome Noah, a couple thousand years. Prior to that, you would have Adam. So the Noah sequence, the Adam sequence would be slightly different due to mutations that accumulate. Plus the Y chromosome, we went over patriarchal drive, where early biblical patriarchs that were having kids at an older age, older in their lives, they'd be passing on more mutations. The evolutionists then can't look at the branches and make the assumptions that they want to. We've pointed out the same thing with the mitochondrial DNA phylogenetic tree, most common haplogroup in Europe, HVR. You'll notice the differing branch lengths. That means people are picking up more mutations in the same amount of time. Okay, the evolutionists cannot look at the DNA differences between chimps and humans and make an assumption based on when they split and then derive a molecular clock that way and say, well, you know, it's this slow, which is way slower than the observed mutation rate. So, yeah, I wanted to point that out. And what we'll do, Matt, this has been pretty awesome, guys. Thank you for our team SFT all night party animals. You know, we've had 40, 50 people all night. We've been going for almost 3.5 hours now. It's 4:30 in the morning. We've still got over 40 people. So God bless you guys for wanting to learn. God bless you for sticking it out. Matt, do you have anything else you want to add? And also, if there's any last final questions in the chat, go ahead. We're going to end it with a quick Dr. Rob Carter clip from our interview with him over a year ago. And then that's where we're going to end it. So before we do that, unless Matt, there's a few things you wanted to add or any questions in the chat, go ahead, brother.
Yeah, I didn't notice it. I didn't really see anything in chat, but if there's anything, nothing there for us. Okay. Well, I guess if the PBS content makers or person itself that made the video watches ours and you're going to reply, let us know why it's okay that we use the observable rate and we're wrong. You use an assumption rate and you're correct. Clearly, starting with an assumption that doesn't match the data can't be considered more logical than our perspective, which is just looking at the data and saying, look at that, it matches our model. That's pretty obvious. So don't dodgeball on us, okay? I know you probably want to, but we get that enough, okay? We get that enough already. So please just do a basic reply to each of the things that we mentioned, because you clearly admit that you have calibrated your results to match what you want to believe. We took the answers and said, look, they match ours. So clearly you're pushing nonsense. That's fine. There's a lot of nonsense out there, which I won't talk about. But it's not good to call it science. And if you can't make predictions, you're not even in the same league as us. So evolution is built on mutations, okay? That's your whole theory. It's based around mutations. If you can't even make predictions based on mutations, that's really embarrassing, because we're making predictions based on mutations, and that's not our theory. So again, the ball is in your court. We challenge you, we dare you, and we will debate you. Both of us, right now, we make the challenge. Either one of us, I don't care.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. We said the same thing to Simon Dan. Here's the thing. We put out very detailed responses because I point out all the time, a lot of the times, these critics say more things wrong in one sentence than letters that exist in that sentence. Okay. So it takes us a long time to, especially Matt and I are the type of people that like to provide as much data as we can to you, because there's just so much data out there. So we like to be thorough. So they'll say things like, oh, this is, 3-4 hours. We can't respond to that. That's fine. Let's discuss it. Let's debate it. It wouldn't be the first time. And we've got the truth on our side. So there's really nothing to fear there. Doki Doki, I appreciate the super sticker. I appreciate the epic chat today. You guys are awesome. Remember, the fun never ends on Standing for Truth, okay? We're going to be back here tomorrow night as well for an epic debate. Does the Bible teach the doctrine of the Trinity? Matt Slick, Taylor Stewart. So if you love those theological related debates, we're going to be having a blast tomorrow. So, brother, I'm going to play this video, a clip from our epic interview with Dr. Rob Carter. It's got to be over a year ago now. Maybe a year and a half, I'm not sure. But anybody new to the channel, if you have not seen this specific interview, I highly recommend you check it out, because we touch on so many great topics, especially topics pertaining to genetics and ancestry. Cat Chat, I appreciate the super sticker, and I appreciate you sticking with us tonight and supporting us. God bless all of you in the chat. So here we go. Let me share this. We'll get through this, and then we're going to call it a night, guys, because here we go. Another 3.5 hour response video. This is the video. Dismantling Gutsick, Gibbon, and Joshua Stramidas on Y chromosome pedigrees. If you're wondering, are there any counters to anything we said today? There's been some really, really bad attempted counters, and we've dealt with them. We've dealt with them in other 2, 3, 4-hour streams. But if you're looking for just like a quick, maybe 10-minute video, definitely check that out. So in the meantime, here we go. I'm going to put it on full screen, Matt. Guys, let me know how the chat is. Just because it's late and we're going on 3.5 hours, I am going to play at 1.5 times speed. But if you haven't seen this video, check it out. It's in the interview playlist. It's titled Science Confirms Biblical Creation, Dr. Rob Carter. So here we go.
It's a common argument that a literal Adam and Eve could not possibly exist. Basically, it comes down to genetic diversity. And some of the critics, including Dr. Francis Collins and Dr. Venema, claim that it would be unfeasible even and unscientific for a single human couple to have, existed ever together. And they would even say that it would require mutations so much are much too fast in order to account for all of the variety that we see in the human population today. Is there any validity to this argument?
Venema has said that, and Francis Collins has said that. In my article, Adam and Eve. I always get confused because the title isn't the same as the URL on I think it's called Adam and Eve Biologos on creation.com, the URL, but it's no, not that one. You showed it earlier. Yes, that's it. I pointed out here that they assume that all variation is due to mutation. So they assume evolution to critique creation. They have an evolutionary creation model, which makes no sense. No, in creation, God can front load the genome with as much diversity as he wants to.
We've been doing this for years, okay? And one of our major assumptions that we talk about all the time is this explanation for the origin of genetic variation, right, Matt? And we point out that there's two very different explanations. You got the evolutionary model, or those that assume aspects of the evolutionary model that say mutations are the ultimate source for genetic variation. That doesn't make sense. Not with what we know about mutations and their degradatory effects, their degenerative effects. They're not helpful. They're not beneficial. They lead to negative variation. The creationists say the ultimate source for genetic variation is design, created heterozygosity being a state of DNA diversity, okay? No joke. And some of these critics wonder why we call them low-hanging fruit. A critic who's been battling us for a while, just the other day, I think it was yesterday, he just pointed out that he finally understood the fact that we as creationists, young earth creationists, explain the ultimate source of genetic variation as being the result of design diversity, right? And therefore, when you have all this diversity and variation front-loaded at creation, you don't need millions of years to build up the variation, right? The evolutionists, they need millions of years to build up the DNA diversity through mutations. And then once the diversity is built up, you can get more varieties because you have DNA variants. Every generation, you have mechanisms like recombination, gene conversion, shuffle up those differences. Well, if the differences are built in from the start and you don't need mutations to build up the variation, then all it takes is one single generation for new varieties, for new chromosomal combinations. Then all you need is breakaway populations, migration, isolation, shifts in heterozygosity or homozygosity. Bam, you got new species. So the point is, just the very basics of our model, a lot of these critics want to be militant, but then they don't understand the basics. If you don't understand the basics, or you choose not to study our model in order to refrain from knocking down a straw man, then how do you expect to get to the point where you're actually going to make better predictions, where you're actually going to challenge our best arguments? So I just had to point that out because I find it flabbergasting oftentimes just how little the critics know about our model. And it's okay. I mean, not everybody has to be genetics masters. The point is, if you're a militant critic and you are making it your mission to, quote unquote, destroy young earth creation, then you better take the time to read some young earth creationist technical papers or study our model if you want to fight against that model, or else you're fighting against something we don't even believe. So I know that was a bit of a Bit of a rant, but I really wanted to point that out. So here we go, brother.
If all variation is caused by mutation, absolutely, it's impossible. You can't get all the variation we see in modern people if we start from Adam and Eve if they're 100% homozygous.
Right.
But what if God front-loaded Adam and Eve with like 20 million variants? Then we can lose half of them and still have as much as we have today. And 20 million is not a lot. I carry 3 or 4 million. You carry 3 or 4 million. Of the common ones, there are probably 3 or 4 million rare ones. That's fine. So it's actually trivial to start with Adam and Eve and get the people we have today as far as the number of variants. Especially if you had 6,000 years of mutation, you can have a lot of new variants appearing in that 6,000 years.
Right. They're coming from their perspective of the evolution having to work in a short time period.
Yeah.
Well, so what are some of the best evidences for a literal Eve and a literal Adam?
Well, the best evidences are the fact that we found Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve. Now, the evolutionists put them in a different place where I would put them, but it's quite clear there's only one human Y chromosome. And all men share a very similar Y chromosome. That didn't have to be true.
One Y chromosome didn't have to be true, turned out to be true, and it's what the Bible predicted. Adam, the first man.
Because if we came from a common ancestral population with chimpanzees, that ancestral population would have had a diversity of Y chromosomes. And when the population split into the lineages that led to humans and chimps, it's possible that we could have, like, in this ancestral population, type A, B, C, and D. Well, if humans have type A and B, and chimpanzees had type B and C, that means there would be a human and chimp who both had type B. They're more closely related to each other than a human is to another human on the Y chromosome.
Notice the Y chromosome diversity, what we see in terms of the aspects of the Y chromosome in humans. That's a fantastic point that Dr. Carter brought up there. It's never been refuted. I've never seen it being addressed, but it doesn't fit. Once again, it's unreasonable to say that this is what deep time proponents expected. No, they didn't predict it. And this is another great reason why, as Dr. Carter pointed out here, guys. Watch as this video, and the majority of it just goes unaddressed, ignored, dodged. It's typical with the critics, guys. The evidence for our position, I'm sorry, it's too powerful. It's overwhelming. It's amazing, actually.
But it didn't work out that way. It's, mathematically and theoretically possible, but it's totally not true. There's only one Y chromosome. In fact, just yesterday, or maybe the day before, they redid the Neanderthal Y chromosome, which is really weird to me because for a long time, we only had female ancient DNA. All the Neanderthals, all the Denisovans, as they were sequencing, they're all female. Like, why is no males? We got like 20 females and no males. Something really weird. But they finally published a partial Neanderthal Y chromosome several years ago, and it was way different. I mean, way out in left field. Like, oh wow, I think it's really different. Well, just a couple days ago, they replaced it with a very modern human one.
Wow.
And the Y chromosome common ancestry Neanderthals and humans, modern humans, is much more recent than it was last week. They totally redated it.
Incredible. Wow. Where can we find that study? I want that one. But so how about molecular clocks then? Do they support a literal Adam and Eve? And is there a constant clock? Is there an average clock that can actually be made?
Yes and no.
Okay.
If you take a constant average for things we can measure in the laboratory today, you can get an approximation of how long ago Y chromosome Adam or mitochondrial Eve lived. It's only a few thousand years. You don't need tens or even hundreds of thousands of years. Now, they don't like doing that, so they're like, the Y chromosome right now, the clock is grounded in the time when Native Americans got to North America. In fact, the Y chromosome guys, they call that a sanity check that appears in several papers. So they're not using genetics, they're using archaeology.
Right? And remember, the PBS video admitted the calibration, assuming the archaeology. Dr. Rob Carter pointed out a sanity check. So it doesn't matter what the genetic data is. It doesn't matter how fast the Y chromosome mutates. It doesn't matter the fact that every single male Y chromosome on the planet is nearly identical. No. What comes first is everything other than genetics, archaeology, geology, their assumed history, the split. So this is just, Matt, isn't it crazy? When did we do this interview? A year and a half ago, maybe?
Yeah.
And it's like, it still goes irrefuted. It's powerful, powerful stuff.
Yeah, it's so funny too because the evolutionist always says, "Oh, all the sciences converge with one another." It's like, no, they don't. They get pulled from different areas and they get melded and force fitted. It's like trying to get a blind person to make a puzzle, but you threw pieces of a different puzzle together, and they're just taking a hammer and trying to make them fit because they can't see anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's them.
It's unbelievable. I remember my second debate with Conspiracy Cats, our rematch. He said that. He said, "Oh, all this independent lines of evidence, corroborates on corroborates on my position." It's like, no, it doesn't. Do you realize how much calibrating and assumptions go into your so-called deep time paradigm? They don't know. They don't see it.
Shocking.
They assume the calibration is needed, right? They like a sanity check. I mean, they have to have the sanity check or else. But remember that they don't question the bigger picture, though, of course. They can question little details, but not the bigger picture. I mean, deep time's true. Universal ancestry is true. Humans are related to chimps. That's unquestionable. If you question that in a peer-reviewed paper, you're not getting published. Okay? I'm sorry. It's not a conspiracy. It's just a fact.
Yeah, remember they rejected one of mine because of the title of it. They said, we're not interested in reviewing such a topic. Oh, okay. So if I would have named it something evolutionary, it might have even gotten by, but frankly, not even looked at. So not biased at all. Got it.
Oh, amen. Exactly. Spot on.
To give them a clock so they can figure out how far long ago mitochondrial atom was, Y chromosome atom was. Wow, that's interesting. But if you look at the measurable mutation rate from one generation to the next, it's a lot faster than they want it to be.
The measurable mutation rate. The mutation rate we can measure in the present. A lot faster than they ever predicted. A lot faster than they ever expected. We as young Earth creationists, we don't need to assume deep time. We don't need to assume some hypothetical split that never happened. We don't need to assume archaeology. We don't need to assume the geological column. That's circular. They're assuming evolution to prove evolution, assuming deep time to prove deep time. No, I'm sorry. The empirical data, the measured mutation rate, it contradicts your model. Get over it. Tap out. Get a new model.
But I don't like the molecular clock idea. I don't think it works. If you look at a Y chromosome family tree and you look at people that are closely related, maybe in the same group, well, some of those people could have twice as many mutations.
That right there, that's important. That's what we always show on those phylogenetic trees. People that are close together, some of them, based on the branch lengths, they have twice as many mutations. People are picking up more mutations in the same amount of time. This ruins the evolutionary molecular clock, ruins it. Mm-hmm. Every assumption they have, it's done. They don't have a molecular clock. We have a fast mutation rate with low variation. We have so many factors at play that are the same types of factors that we expect from a biblical model anyways, patriarchal drive being one of them. So it's really bad for them, as you know, Matt.
As their cousin or relative that came from the same founder of that group. So like group R1b, I'm an R1b, 80% of Western Europeans are R1b. If you look at the R1b founder and then you measure the branch lengths of all the individuals that are R1b, there are people twice as many mutations as.
So exactly as you explained. So you got a common ancestor here, right? Bunch of branches going out because they're all related. They're all going back to that common ancestor. But the branches are all differing length. I mean, you have people in the same amount of time picking up more mutations than their cousins. They're all going back to the same common ancestor. And the evolutionists want to make assumptions about the split. And they want to try and say, well, the phylogenetic rate, is much slower than the pedigree rate. These are just things they never deal with. I've never seen Dodgeball Dan even attempt to touch on this. Herman May's stuff. It's just, they've lost. They know it.
Wait a minute. That means there's no clock. That means you can't put your finger on the tree and know how long it took for these many mutations to accumulate. And yet, if you just do a rough approximation, everything is young. There's another issue. I wrote an article called Patriarchal Drive. I published it in the Journal of Creation. It's in computer modeling. I said, we kind of know that the older a father is, the more mutations he passes on to his children. And I said, but if Noah was over 500 years old when he had Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and that population was reduced to 6 people, that means those 3 sons, their father was over 500 years old when they were born. That means they each got a huge dose of mutations. And as that post-flood population starts growing, these really old men are going to continue to have children. The older they get, the more mutations their children are going to have. I call it the patriarchal drive. And what it does is it totally messes up the average. It takes, some kids are being born in this population with 800 mutations, and some kids are being born to a young father and they only have 10 mutations. So you can't look at the branch length on the tree and know that the branch length equals time. It does settle down after a while when now, men today aren't having children when we're 500-600 years old. We tend to have children when we're 30 years old. That's a huge difference. So there are problems with molecular clock archaeologically, genetically, philosophically, mathematically. Yeah, we can still use it if we want to.
Okay.
All right.
When it comes to recombination, it's been asserted that the rates are too slow to account for the de novo creation of Adam and Eve around 6,000 years ago. Is this an argument you press?
Well, what's the recombination rate? It depends on, we used to think it was random. It's not, it's controlled by a gene. The PRDM9 enzyme looks for a specific set of letters on the chromosome, grabs onto it, and recombines.
Okay.
Africans have more of those sites than Europeans.
Oh,
Whoa, wait a minute now, hold it. That messes up the molecular clock right there. Because if you have more recombination per generation, your population can hold more diversity. You have more pieces of DNA in the population. So how long ago was this out of Africa event? Well, I don't know. If Africans have more recombination, they're going to look older just because of the amount of recombination.
Right.
And because mutation will destroy the PRDM9 sites over time, it's much more likely, I forget what the letter combination is, but it's much more likely to destroy it than to create it through a mutation. So our recombination rate should be slowing down over time.
So, okay, so that would, and so many good points.
And we'll end it there. And that's what goes back to Joshua Stramidas as well, where these critics want to assume constant recombination rates. They want to assume so much that's just unrealistic. But I think that was icing on the cake. Anybody interested, please go check out that full interview. So much fascinating information. Doki Doki, thank you so much. Patriarchal Drive in the early post-flood population by Dr. Rob Carter. So I don't know about you, Matt, but I am wiped. I'm exhausted. We've been going 3 hours and a half. We've gone over a lot of technical data. Of course, anybody ever has questions, inquiries, let us know. You guys in the chat, you guys are superstars, party animals. Party animals in terms of you like to stay up late and learn with us. The truth is important. The critics, they're coming at us with arguments and criticisms, and we're here to destroy these arguments. We're here to promote the truth. So one last thing I'll say, just in case good old PBS sees this and thinks, I'm going to be out of a job. No, I'm just kidding. But if he's going to think, half my subscribers are going to convert, I'm going to say this is all fair use. This is for education purposes. We provided plenty of commentary, 3.5 hours on a 9-minute video. So just want to point that out. Anyways, Matt, final words, final thoughts, and then we're going to bed, brother.
Yeah, I had to go inside. I was yelling outside so much. I had to go in.
Your neighbors are like, what do you do? We're trying to sleep out here.
Yeah, I'm yelling about mutation rates. They're probably just like, this guy's crazier all the time.
Oh, they're probably thinking you're speaking another language. I mean, heterozygosity and mitochondrial eve. I mean,
yeah, maybe they're outside in lawn chairs just listening, going, wow.
Yeah. Wow. You know what? I think I am going to convey. Maybe you just won a family to the Lord, brother. You never know.
Yeah, right. I mean, think about the what we've been able to do so far with the information that we have. We've been getting it out to so many people that random strangers just come along and just know who I am. I'm like, what in the world is going on? Very strange, but nonetheless, it's good. Making an impact, so that's pretty good. We've only been online for a short time, so.
Amen, bro. 3 years, guys, and all the glory to God. And so much thanks to our supporters, all the thanks to our supporters. I mean, if we didn't have you guys supporting, sharing our content, enjoying the content, and something I've noticed, Matt and I talk about this, you guys in the chat, I mean, you really know your stuff. I mean, we see the critics come along and we see you guys just refute them right out of the live chat. So, this is a family, the Team SFT family. So, God bless all of you. I hope you had fun tonight. I had fun. This is addicting. Matt and I look forward to this, every night. So, Matt, great job, brother. Fantastic job as always. Guys, if you haven't picked up the new Global or Local Flood yet, the book that the critics are dodging. We'll have to make a new commercial. You want a book that the critics are running from? Here it is. So, any final words?
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, that's a fun book for sure. And I don't know. This was a good video, man. I might put this on my channel tomorrow.
This will be the perfect re-upload. So definitely, I'll get it up on the website as well. So
nice. Oh well, yeah, that'll do it, man. That was pretty good for a 9-minute video.
Yeah, a 9-minute video. Remember Strawman Dan? He's given up. I've noticed Strawman Dan ever since our rebuttal. He's really, really just going at the flat earthers, the Bigfooters, the hollow earthers. He realized, I think Conspiracy Cats confronted him and said, you know what, Strawman Dan?
Yeah.
Not a good idea.
Not a good idea. Don't play with them. Yeah.
Yeah,
don't play with those
the
guys.
big boys.
Yeah. Yeah. We called them directly out. We said, hey, let's see you defend any of the nonsense you made up in that video. He hasn't made another video against us since.
No. And the videos he did, like, make a video response to, they're hilarious because, they got thousands of views with like hundreds and hundreds of dislikes. So
amazing. Let me guess. Did he grab like old content like when I first started?
As always.
Of course. See, there it is. Yeah.
So anyways, brother, let's go get some sleep. I appreciate it, Matt. This was a ton of fun. Guys, we'll re-upload this because there's so much information. We'll re-upload it to Matt's channel. And tomorrow we'll see you back here at 8 o'clock for the epic Matt Slick versus Taylor Stewart debate. Next week, we've got a week of more awesome debates. Is there evidence for human evolution? Jackson Rowe and Ken Hovind. And then Snake was writing Ken Hovind, Genesis, Flood, Fact or Fiction. So the fun never ends. Matt, God bless, brother. Fantastic job. To the audience, God bless you as well. Standing for Truth and Matt Man are out.